Welcome, dear listener, to a journey into the shadowy corners of medieval history. I'm so glad you've joined me for some quiet storytelling as the day comes to a close. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. I always enjoy seeing the global community of history lovers gathered here. And if you find these gentle excursions into the past as fascinating as I do, I invite you to subscribe so we can embark on many more adventures together. Now, make yourself comfortable, settle in, and let your mind wander back in time with me. Imagine a world of grand castles and glittering courts, of chivalrous knights and lavish pageantry. This is Europe in the Middle Ages, a time that has long captured our imaginations. But beneath the surface of all that splendor and romance, a darker current often ran. In the halls of power, intrigue, jealousy, and ambition simmered, bubbling over at times into murder most foul. And in this precarious world, even kings and queens could meet shocking, untimely ends. Tonight, we'll explore some of the most disturbing royal deaths of the medieval era. Tales of torture, madness, poison, and betrayal. The lives of the monarchs we'll meet were shaped by the ruthless dynastic politics of their age, where the promise of power always came with a price. But don't worry, my goal isn't to keep you awake with grisly details, but rather to let you drift off to sleep with a richer sense of the complex tapestry of the past. So let's allow our minds to slip softly into the mists of history. Our first stop is England in the early 14th century, where we find King Edward II presiding over a troubled reign. Born in 1284, Edward was the fourth son of the mighty King Edward I, who had earned the nickname Longshanks for his tall stature and extended his royal reach into Wales and Scotland. But young Edward was cut from a different cloth than his warrior father. He grew into a handsome but somewhat idle prince, more interested in leisurely pursuits than the arts of war and governance. When Edward I died in 1307, his 23-year-old son ascended to the throne as Edward II, inheriting a kingdom rife with tensions. He quickly made himself unpopular with England's powerful barons by lavishing favour and titles on his close friend and rumoured lover Piers Gaveston. Tall, witty and flamboyant, Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight and had a magnetic hold on the young king's affections. But to the outraged nobility, he was an arrogant upstart whose influence over Edward seemed to exceed all propriety. Their discontent would come to a head in 1312, when a group of rebel barons hunted down and murdered Gaveston, stabbing him to death in a lonely field. Devastated by the loss of his companion, Edward sank into a deep melancholy. But his troubles were only beginning. Military defeats against the Scots, excessive spending, and the elevation of another unpopular favourite, Hugh Despenser, further eroded his standing. By 1326, Edward's fed-up Queen Isabella had turned against him and fled to France with their young son, the future Edward III. There she took up with a powerful English nobleman in exile named Roger Mortimer, and together they raised an army and invaded England. Edward II's support quickly crumbled, and he was forced to abdicate the throne in favour of his teenage son, becoming the first English king to be deposed since the Norman conquest over 250 years before. The humiliated former king was taken into custody, separated from his male favourites, and shuffled secretly between castles as a prisoner. He eventually ended up at lonely Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, held under guard in the custody of Mortimer's men. And it was there in September 1327 that his story took its grisliest turn. According to a famous account written some decades later, Edward's captors decided to end the risk of his supporters rallying to restore him to power. So one night, they held the deposed king down and brutally killed him by thrusting a red-hot poker into his anus, leaving no visible mark of violence on the body. The notorious red-hot poker story has titillated and horrified for centuries, though many historians today suspect it was a much later embellishment. More contemporary accounts suggest Edward may have been smothered with heavy mattresses or slowly starved, though the truth is lost to time. Whatever the exact circumstances, the wretched demise of Edward II marked a sad end for a weak, ineffectual king brought low by his misrule and the machinations of his ambitious wife and her lover. When word reached the outside world that the former king was dead at age 43, reactions ranged from grim satisfaction to quiet pity for a man widely seen as a failure. Though his violent end was shocking, his life and reign had long since withered. In a sense, Edward II's death was less a sudden rupture than the inevitable final unravelling of a king not quite fit for his crown. His two-decade rule, disastrous and disappointing, would be overshadowed by that of his son, Edward III, who grew into the mighty warrior king his father had never been. The memory of Edward II faded into that of a tragic footnote, a king who had stumbled from one mistake to the next until he fell right out of history. Across the English Channel, another king was coming undone under very different circumstances. Charles VI of France, known to posterity as Charles the Beloved or Charles the Mad, was a promising young ruler whose reign spiraled into chaos under the shadow of mental illness. Born in 1368 to King Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon, Charles was an affable, charming child, if not quite as brilliant as his bookish, intellectual father. Though his father died in 1380, when Charles was just 11, he was ably guided through his adolescence by a regency council led by his stately, poised mother and his uncle Philip the Bold, the powerful Duke of Burgundy. When Charles came of age and took full control of his reign in 1388, he seemed ready to lead France into a brighter future. He was generous and amiable, eager to make peace with England after years of intermittent warfare, and determined to be a strong king like his father. With his lively, pretty Bavarian wife Isabeau by his side, all augured well for a glittering reign full of art, luxury, and royal authority. But just 4 years later, an eerie incident shattered the calm and marked a dark turning point in Charles's life. In the summer of 1392, the 23-year-old king was travelling with his entourage in the forest of Le Mans when a crazed, half-naked man leaped out of the trees and grabbed his horse's bridle, shouting, "Ride no further, noble king! There is treason afoot!" Though the king's men quickly chased the madman away, Charles became agitated and frightened. Then, a short time later, one of the royal pages nodded off in the saddle and dropped his lance, which clanged loudly against a helmet carried by another page. At the sudden sound, Charles flew into a panic, drew his sword, and began slashing wildly at his own men, crying, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy." The king's younger brother Louis, the Duke of Orléans, bravely threw himself into Charles's arms and pleaded with him to calm down. But the king, now in a blind rage, struck him repeatedly until Louis fell bleeding into the arms of their uncles. The men could only subdue their king by tricking him into dismounting, then tackling him to the ground and carrying him back to the capital tied up with ropes. The traumatic incident seemed to unhinge something in Charles's mind. From that day forth, he fell into a strange malady characterized by bouts of delusional paranoia, mania, and amnesia. Sometimes he raged like a wild beast, smashing furniture, running through corridors, howling like a wolf, and refusing to bathe or change clothes for weeks. Other times he grew melancholy and lethargic, sitting in a depressed torpor, hardly recognizing his wife and children. Sometimes his memory lapsed so severely that he forgot his own name and title. His most peculiar delusion was a persistent belief that his body was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. Charles's mystifying ailment which modern physicians suspect may have been a form of paranoid schizophrenia, utterly changed the man he had been. Gone was the affable king who had graciously hosted glittering balls. In his place was a pitiable wreck who seemed to vanish inside his own mind for months at a time. The kingdom, meanwhile, fell into disorder as various relatives of the king, known as the Princes of the Blood, squabbled for custody of the mad monarch and control of the government. For the next 30 years until his death, Charles VI enjoyed only brief windows of lucidity, his life a blur of anguished breakdowns and fragile recoveries. Some periods of madness lasted a few weeks. His longest stretched to a desperate 9 months. During one manic episode, he became convinced he was St. George and ran around the palace gardens challenging trees to a joust. Another time, he refused to be parted from his royal sword, wielding it at the dinner table and frightening all who approached. Through it all, the poor, beleaguered Queen Isabeau did her best to care for her afflicted husband and hold the kingdom together. She bore him 12 children, though she was soon eclipsed in influence by Charles's grasping uncles. The king's younger brother Louis, the witty, dissolute Duke of Orléans, took advantage of the chaos to install himself as the power behind the throne. He happily raided the treasury to fund his extravagant lifestyle and carried on a not-so-secret affair with Queen Isabeau. By the early 15th century, the strife between Louis of Orléans and his cousin John, the Dour Duke of Burgundy, had escalated into a bloody civil war. With an incapacitated king unable to impose order, the Burgundians and Armagnacs, supporters of the Orléans faction, engaged in vicious retaliatory attacks. Poor Charles spent his final years as a mere pawn in their power struggle, lucid enough to grieve but too feeble to regain control. In the fall of 1422, after 3 decades of madness, Charles VI's suffering finally came to an end. The 53-year-old king was found dead one morning in his shabby chambers in the Hôtel Saint-Paul, the dilapidated Parisian residence where he had holed up during his last bouts of derangement. The cause of death was never definitively determined, though many whispered that he had been poisoned or smothered to clear the way for the next ruler. Others said his fragile body had simply given out, his mind and spirit long since broken. Charles the Mad left behind a reeling, fractured kingdom that would soon be devastated by the renewal of the 100 Years' War with England. The English king, Henry V, had already seized the opportunity of French disarray to conquer the Normandy port of Harfleur and crush the flower of French chivalry at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Just 2 years before Charles's death, Henry had occupied Paris and forced the French court to sign the humiliating Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited the French king's own son and named Henry the rightful heir to the throne of France. Though poor Charles was oblivious in his final madness, his realm had crumbled around him. The promising kingdom he had inherited as a boy lay in tatters, half in the hands of a foreign conqueror and the rest torn apart by squabbling princes. It would take a peasant girl with visions of angels, Joan of Arc, to rouse the French to reclaim their patrimony. But that is a tale for another night. For now, dear listener, let us pause and reflect on the sad fate of Charles VI. There is perhaps no starker illustration of how mental illness, when it struck, could bring even the mightiest of monarchs to ruin. The once lively sovereign spent his last decades as a wretched ghost of himself, a stranger in his own mind. Those who had known him as a youth mourned the vital king he might have been, while those who knew him only as a madman shook their heads at the irony of a reign begun with such promise and optimism. Yet even in his misfortune, there are glimmers of grace in Charles's story. The devotion of his wife Isabeau, who remained by his side through the worst of his illness, speaks to the steadfastness of the human heart. And in the end, the troubled king's legacy would be somewhat redeemed by his descendants. His grandson Louis XI, known as the Universal Spider for his wily ways, would complete the rebuilding of the French monarchy and set the stage for a stronger, more centralized France to come. As the candle flickers and the night deepens, we leave behind the tormented Charles VI and turn our gaze south to the sun-drenched streets of 14th century Naples. There we find another fascinating monarch whose untimely demise would leave a haunting mystery. Her name was Joanna I, and she was one of the most powerful and scandalous queens in medieval Europe. Born in 1325, Joanna was the eldest granddaughter of Robert the Wise, the sagacious king of Naples, famed for his refined court and patronage of the arts and learning. Precociously intelligent and charming, with red gold hair and a regal bearing, Joanna was clearly her formidable grandfather's favourite. So deep was Robert's affection that he manoeuvred to make her his heir, decreeing that the Neapolitan crown could pass to a female successor. When old Robert died in 1343, the ravishing 18-year-old Joanna inherited not just one but two kingdoms, Naples and Provence, along with immense wealth and influence. She was soon one of the most eligible royal ladies in Europe, and her hand in marriage became a sought-after prize. But headstrong Joanna had her own ideas about matrimony. Rather than wedding one of the high-born suitors who sought her favour, she scandalised Europe by suddenly marrying her own cousin, the dashing Prince Andrew of Hungary. It seemed a love match at first, but the relationship soon soured. Joanna resented her husband's boorishness and his attempts to claim authority in her domains. The Hungarian prince, meanwhile, grew increasingly bitter over his lack of real power. Before long, the couple were living practically separate lives, each with their own circle of friends and advisors. Palace gossip swirled with rumours of the Queen's indiscretions and the spies her husband had set to watch her every move. Then, one fateful night in 1345, Prince Andrew was found brutally murdered in the palace gardens, his body mangled and disfigured. Suspicion immediately fell on Queen Joanna and her rumoured lover, the handsome nobleman Louis of Taranto. Andrew's Hungarian relatives accused the Queen of orchestrating the murder, and Joanna soon found herself facing a full-blown political crisis. In a daring gambit to assert her innocence, the young queen set off on a journey to Avignon, where Pope Clement VI held court. There, in front of the papal curia, she pled her case with such charm, passion, and persuasiveness that the smitten pontiff cleared her of all wrongdoing. More than that, he granted her a dispensation to marry her lover Louis, who also happened to be her first cousin. The scandal only enhanced Joanna's fame and notoriety. For the next 3 decades, the bewitching queen would rule over the most glittering court in Italy, renowned for its sumptuous feasts, literary salons, and masquerade balls. She would take 2 more husbands, surround herself with artists and poets, and become celebrated as a wise and generous ruler. Petrarch would praise her profound intellect and dedication to learning, while Boccaccio would immortalize her in literature as a great patroness. But Joanna's life was also stalked by tragedy, betrayal, and the long shadow of the murder in the garden. Her third husband, James IV of Majorca, would cruelly abandon her and their young daughter. Her most trusted friend and advisor, Niccolò Acciaioli, would turn against her in a bitter power struggle. And always, the vengeful Hungarians watched and waited for a chance to make her pay for Prince Andrew's blood. That chance would come in the summer of 1382, when Joanna was 56 years old and had ruled for nearly 4 decades. Her enemies made their move swiftly and ruthlessly. One day in July, the Queen was entertaining an ambassador at her castle, overlooking the Bay of Naples. Suddenly, armed men burst into the room and seized Joanna, dragging her away to a waiting ship. The kidnappers were Hungarian agents, and they brought the struggling queen to a grim fortress in the city of Muro, where they imprisoned her in a tiny, foul-smelling cell. What happened next has never been entirely clear. Some say Joanna's captors tried to force her to abdicate in favor of her Hungarian relatives. Others claim they tried to cajole her into confessing to Prince Andrew's murder all those years ago. What is certain is that late one night, the Queen's jailers entered her cell, pushed her to the window, and coldly shoved her out into the darkness. Joanna fell from the high tower and died instantly when she struck the ground far below. Her battered body was left to lie in the mud where it fell. We turn now to one of the most bizarre and brutal downfalls in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. The grisly execution of Gunther von Schwarzburg, a would-be emperor whose reach exceeded his grasp. In the chaotic era of the 14th century, the imperial throne was a prize that many ambitious nobles dreamed of seizing. The Holy Roman Empire was an elective monarchy, with the emperor chosen by a group of powerful prince-electors. But they rarely agreed on a candidate, leading to fierce rivalries and competing claims to the crown. Enter Gunther von Schwarzburg, the scion of a noble family from central Germany. A skilled warrior and charismatic leader, Gunther had his eye on the ultimate prize, the imperial throne. In 1349, he saw his chance to make a play for power. The reigning emperor was Charles IV of Luxembourg, a shrewd and formidable ruler who had his share of enemies among the German nobility. Some of these disgruntled electors decided to throw their support behind Gunther as an anti-king, a rival claimant to challenge Charles's authority. With a hastily assembled army, Gunther marched to Frankfurt, the traditional site of imperial elections. There, his allies went through the motions of proclaiming him the rightful Holy Roman Emperor. But there was just one problem. Charles IV had no intention of giving up his crown. The incumbent emperor quickly gathered his own forces and set out to crush this upstart rival. In a decisive battle near the city of Eltville, Charles won a resounding victory, scattering Gunther's army and capturing the would-be usurper himself. Now, in the Middle Ages, mercy was rarely shown to failed rebels, especially those who dared to challenge the divinely appointed authority of a reigning monarch. Charles IV was determined to make an example of Gunther, to send a message that would echo across the empire. Treason would not be tolerated. What followed was an excruciating and horrific public execution that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of medieval observers. Gunther was subjected to a slow, agonizing death, his body systematically destroyed with clinical brutality. First, he was lashed to a large wooden wheel, a common torture device of the time. His limbs were stretched out and tied to the spokes, leaving him spread-eagled and helpless. Then, the wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster. As Gunther spun, the executioners took heavy iron bars and began to smash his arms, legs, and ribs to splinters with sickening crunches. This was known as being broken on the wheel, a punishment reserved for the worst criminals and traitors. But the ordeal was far from over. Once Gunther's shattered body was a bloody, mangled mess, the wheel was stopped. In a final act of savagery, his limp form was untied and literally ripped into 4 pieces, a process known as quartering. Each gory quarter was to be displayed in a different part of the empire, a hideous reminder of the price of rebellion. As a final indignity, Gunther's severed head was impaled on a spike and mounted above the gates of Frankfurt, where it remained for weeks, a macabre warning to any who might harbour similar ambitions. The gruesome spectacle of Gunther's execution sent shockwaves throughout Germany and beyond. It was a stark demonstration of the ruthlessness with which medieval monarchs dealt with challenges to their power, and the horrific creativity they employed in staging these judicial killings as public entertainment and political theatre. For Charles IV, it was a chance to flex his imperial muscle and show that he was not a ruler to be trifled with. Gunther's short-lived rebellion was crushed along with his body, and his name became a byword for foolish, overreaching ambition. But while Gunther von Schwarzburg may have been largely forgotten by history, his grisly end stands as a testament to the dark brutality that lurked behind the pomp and pageantry of medieval kingship. In a world where power was all, no death was too cruel for those who dared to grasp for the ultimate prize. From one ill-fated royal challenger, we turn now to a very different kind of courtly conflict. A poisonous family feud that pitted mother-in-law against daughter-in-law in a struggle that would end with one of them starved to death in a dismal dungeon. This is the story of Ermengarde of Anjou, a formidable French noblewoman who was never afraid to fight dirty when it came to protecting her own position and that of her beloved son. Born around 970 AD into the powerful House of Anjou, Ermengarde was a woman who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to speak it. She made a splendid match with the Duke of Burgundy and bore him a son who would go on to become King Robert II, known as Robert the Pious, for his extreme religious devotion. You might think that being the mother of the king would have satisfied Ermengarde's ambitions, but she was just getting started. As Robert grew into manhood and took the throne, Ermengarde became the classic example of the meddling mother-in-law from hell. She was determined to keep her hooks in her son and her place at the center of power, no matter what it took. The greatest threat to Ermengarde's influence was, of course, another woman, Robert's beautiful young bride, Constance of Arles. The vivacious Provençal princess was the daughter of the Count of Toulouse, and she quickly won the heart of the pious, but easily swayed Robert. For Ermengarde, Constance represented everything she despised, a frivolous, fashionable foreigner who threatened to steal away her son's loyalty and supplant her own authority. The stage was set for a battle royale between the two strong-willed women, with hapless Robert caught in the middle. Ermengarde wasted no time in launching a smear campaign against her detested daughter-in-law. She spread malicious rumours that Constance was unfaithful, entertaining a string of lovers behind Robert's back. Ermengarde even hinted that Constance's children might not be Robert's true heirs, a scandalous accusation in a world obsessed with royal bloodlines. At first, Robert was torn between loyalty to his mother and love for his wife. But as Ermengarde's poisonous whispers grew ever louder, the weak-willed king finally caved to his mother's demands. In a move that shocked the court, Robert agreed to have Constance locked away in a convent, effectively imprisoning her to remove her influence. But Constance was no shrinking violet. Outraged at her treatment, she managed to escape her captivity and flee back to her family in the south. There, she rallied an army of her Provençal kinsmen and launched a military campaign against her own husband and monstrous mother-in-law. Robert, spurred on by Ermengarde, raised his own forces to counter his rebellious wife. The two armies met in a fierce battle near the Burgundian capital of Dijon. In the chaos of the fighting, who should be captured but Ermengarde herself, the architect of all this familial strife? In a fitting twist of fate, Constance gave her loathsome mother-in-law a taste of her own medicine. She had Ermengarde thrown into a dank underground dungeon where the once proud noblewoman was left to rot. No mercy was shown to the woman who had so cruelly schemed against the young queen. As days turned into weeks, Ermengarde languished in her dark, filthy cell, growing weaker and weaker. Constance had no intention of allowing her rival a quick or easy death. She let Ermengarde waste away in agonizing hunger, her life ebbing slowly in the gloom. Finally, after 6 excruciating months, Ermengarde breathed her last, her emaciated body giving up the ghost. It was an ignominious end for a woman who had once held such sway over the royal court, starved to death in a squalid hole at the hands of the daughter-in-law she had so viciously despised. In the end, Constance emerged victorious from her bitter marital war. She reconciled with a chastened Robert and ruled by his side as a powerful queen. But the scars of the vicious feud with Ermengarde would linger long after the vile Duchess's bones had turned to dust in her dungeon tomb. The story of Ermengarde and Constance is a reminder of the special venom that often flowed between medieval mothers and daughters-in-law, especially when a crown was at stake. In a world where royal women were expected to scheme and battle to secure their place, even the closest family bonds could curdle into murderous hatred. So ends our tour of tortured family ties, and the lonely demise of one of the Middle Ages' most malicious mother-in-laws. With that, we draw the curtains on our pageant of gruesome and shocking royal deaths from medieval times. Throughout this morbid survey, we've seen the many and varied ways that the crowned heads of the Middle Ages met their untimely ends. At the hands of spiteful spouses, murderous mistresses, callous kinsmen, and rebellious rivals, we've witnessed the lethal limits of royal power, how even the mightiest monarchs could be brought low by a well-placed poison or a hot poker to the posterior. The deaths we've explored stand as a reminder of the cutthroat and often literal nature of courtly politics in an age when life was nasty, brutish, and for kings and queens, all too often short. But while the lives of these ill-fated rulers may have been filled with treachery and ended in tragedy, their stories have endured through the centuries, passed down as cautionary tales and morbid monuments to the perils of power. In a way, they have achieved a kind of immortality, their names and fates forever etched into the dark annals of history. And as we drift off to sleep, perchance to dream of less disturbing demises, we can take comfort in the knowledge that our own ends will likely be far more peaceful than those of the luckless royals who came before us. So concludes our guided tour of the most memorably macabre royal deaths of the Middle Ages. May you rest more easily than they did, content in your freedom from the fatal intrigues and lethal limitations of life at the top of the feudal heap. Until next time, sweet dreams. As we've seen, the treacherous politics of medieval Europe meant that even the grandest kings and queens were never safe from those who coveted their power. Rivals, relatives, and rebellious subjects constantly circled, waiting for any sign of weakness to strike. And when they did, the results were often shockingly brutal, as our next royal victim learned all too well. Peter the Faun of Castile, known to history as Peter the Cruel, was never meant to be a beloved ruler. The only legitimate son of Alfonso X of Castile, Peter gained the throne at just 15 years old in 1350. But even as a teenager, he already showed signs of the capricious cruelty that would define his reign. Young Peter was known for his explosive temper and sadistic impulses. Chroniclers tell of how he delighted in personally executing prisoners with his own dagger, watching with fascination as the life drained from their bodies. He kept a pet lion and bear in his palace, allegedly feeding them live human prey for his own amusement. Any perceived insult or disloyalty could provoke him to a murderous rage. As king, Peter ruled with an iron fist, ruthlessly crushing any challenge to his power. He quarreled viciously with his own family, believing they plotted to overthrow him. Peter had his own half-brothers locked away in castles or exiled abroad. But mere imprisonment wasn't enough to sate his paranoia and vengeful urges. In a shocking purge in 1358, Peter invited several of his half-brothers to a reconciliation dinner, where he had them suddenly seized and executed on the spot, right there in the palace dining hall amid the splattered remnants of the feast. His men then rampaged through the castle, rounding up and slaughtering dozens more of Peter's own relatives, leaving a bloodbath in their wake. But Peter's reign of terror couldn't quash the brewing resentment against his tyrannical ways. Rebellious nobles rallied around the king's exiled half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, who launched a guerrilla war to overthrow the king and claim the throne himself. It would prove to be a long and bloody conflict. In 1366, Henry made huge inroads against his half-brother, conquering large swaths of Castile and forcing Peter to flee to Gascony. There, Peter enlisted the help of the ruthless English prince Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince for his dark armour. With English reinforcements, Peter launched a vicious counter-campaign, retaking Castile in a string of bloody battles and merciless reprisals against the rebels. Once again, any leniency was met with betrayal in Peter's eyes. He continued his purges, burning entire rebel villages to the ground and filling his dungeons with former allies he now distrusted. The king's own chambers in the royal castle of Seville became a de facto torture chamber where Peter personally oversaw the agonizing deaths of his enemies. But Henry would not relent in his mission to depose his hated half-brother. In 1369, he launched a fresh campaign with the backing of the French crown, driving deep into Castilian territory. Henry's forces met Peter's head-on at the Battle of Montiel, a massive clash in the heart of Spain. On the battlefield, Peter led the charge with his customary ferocity, laying waste to Henry's front lines. But in the chaos of combat, the king suddenly found himself unhorsed and isolated, with the enemy closing in on all sides. Thrown from his steed, Peter tried desperately to cut his way out with his sword as rebel troops swarmed around him. But it was no use. At last, run to ground, an exhausted Peter was dragged from the fray, kicking and yelling curses, his fine armor tarnished with blood and churned up mud. Bruised and bound, the king was brought before his half-brother, the man he had tried for so long to destroy. Face to face at last, Henry and Peter stared at each other with pure, seething hatred. No more words were needed. Henry drew his dagger and lunged at his captive half-brother, stabbing him again and again in a frenzied outburst of rage. Peter crumpled to the ground in a widening pool of his own blood, his last breath a gurgling malediction against the brother who had finally bested him. And so ended the reign of Peter the Cruel, one of medieval Europe's most infamous tyrants. Fittingly, his own vicious ways had spawned the rebellion that ultimately consumed him, proving once again that even the mightiest kings couldn't escape the consequences of their own cruelty. The tormented kingdom of Castile would pass to Henry, ushering in a new ruling dynasty, while Peter would forever be remembered as a cautionary tale of unchecked brutality. As we've seen time and again, the medieval world was one where power was always fragile, where even fearsome rulers sat uneasily on their thrones, never knowing when the next usurper might strike. And when they did, it was often with the same ruthlessness the rulers themselves had wielded in life. Such was the case with our next subject, the powerful Scandinavian ruler Harald Bluetooth. A mighty Viking king, Harald rose to rule all of Denmark and much of Norway in the 10th century. His reign represented a watershed moment as Scandinavia transitioned from the traditional Norse religion to Christianity. Harald himself had been born into the old pagan ways, the son of the legendary Viking raider King Gorm the Old. But in 960 AD, Harald made the momentous decision to be baptized into the Christian faith, taking the name Bluetooth. Historians still debate the reasons for his conversion. Some speculate it was a shrewd political move to strengthen ties with the Christian rulers of mainland Europe. Others believe Harald had a genuine spiritual revelation. Whatever his motivations, Harald threw himself into spreading the new faith throughout his realms. He ordered the construction of grand churches and sponsored missionaries to travel the land, preaching the gospel to the staunchly pagan populace. These efforts earned Harald the patronage of the Catholic Church, which recognized him as a key ally in Christianizing the unruly Vikings. But not all of Harald's subjects were eager to abandon the old gods. As Christian customs began supplanting traditional Norse practices, resentment bubbled up among those who felt their way of life was under threat. Some nobles bristled at Harald's growing power, which was bolstered by his new religious authority. According to the sagas, the greatest challenge to Harald's rule came from his own son, a brash and ambitious prince named Sweyn Forkbeard. By all accounts, Sweyn was the picture of a daring Viking warrior, tall, strong, and fearless, with a lust for battle and the charisma to draw men to his banner. But he had little interest in his father's newfangled Christian faith. For Sweyn, power was something to be seized by strength, not granted by some newfangled god. He was hungry for glory and chafed under his father's authority, believing that Harald's Christian leanings had made him weak. The headstrong young prince began to openly defy his father, forging alliances with discontented pagan nobles who yearned for a return to the old ways. Tensions reached a breaking point in the 980s AD when Sweyn rallied his allies for a full-scale rebellion against Harald's rule. The aging king marshalled his own forces to meet the challenge, and all of Denmark was soon embroiled in vicious internecine warfare between father and son. Harald was still a formidable warrior, and he wasn't about to meekly surrender his crown. For 2 years, the king managed to beat back Sweyn's repeated attempts to unseat him, but the toll of constantly quelling rebellions was wearing on the now elderly ruler. In 986, Harald was dealt a crushing blow when his eldest son and chosen heir was killed in battle against Sweyn's forces. Weakened and demoralized, Harald retreated to his stronghold in Jutland, perhaps sensing that his long reign was finally nearing its end. As Sweyn and his army approached the king's fortress, Harald made one last desperate attempt to negotiate with his rebellious son. He sent messengers ahead, offering Sweyn a truce if he would lay down his arms and reconcile with his father. But Sweyn was done with compromise. He had come to claim his birthright by force, and no amount of fatherly overtures would deter him now. As Harald waited anxiously for word from his son, Sweyn was already leading his warriors in a fierce assault on the king's stronghold. The old king was caught off guard when Sweyn's forces came storming into his chambers. Harald was cut down almost immediately, his guards overwhelmed by the rebels' superior numbers. Sweyn himself delivered the final blow, plunging his sword into his father's chest as the old man lay bleeding on the floor. And so Harald Bluetooth, the great Christian king of the Vikings, was slain by his own pagan son. The sagas say that as Harald lay dying, he uttered a final lament for the misguided rebellion that had sealed his doom. "My son has betrayed me," he gasped with his last breath. "And so I am slain by my own kin, as I have lived in fear of for so long." Sweyn, for his part, felt no remorse for the slaying of his father. He believed that in killing Harald, he had delivered Denmark from the grip of a weak and misguided ruler. Sweyn immediately claimed the throne for himself and set about violently purging the kingdom of Christian influence with all the fervor of a true believer in the old gods. Fittingly, the name Forkbeard, by which Sweyn would be known to history, was actually a mocking epithet given to him by his Christian enemies. It referred to the long split beard he wore in the style of a pagan warrior, a symbol of his rejection of his father's faith. In the end, Harald Bluetooth's dream of a Christian Denmark would not long outlive him. Paganism experienced a brief resurgence under Sweyn's rule, but the tide of history was already turning against the old ways. Within a few generations, Sweyn's own son Canute would preside over Denmark's permanent conversion to Christianity. Harald, meanwhile, would be remembered as something of a transitional figure, a Viking king who had the vision to embrace Christianity, but not the means to make it stick. His grisly fate is a reminder of just how precarious even the most powerful rulers could be in a medieval world defined by religious strife, shifting allegiances, and brutal familial betrayals. With that, we'll draw our examination of the most disturbing royal deaths of the Middle Ages to a close. From the tormented Edward II to the tyrant Peter the Cruel, to the visionary but ill-fated Harald Bluetooth, we've seen how even the most formidable kings and queens could meet shockingly brutal ends in this age of constant upheaval and cutthroat politics. These medieval monarchs lived and died by the sword in a world where power was always fleeting and enemies were forever waiting for a chance to strike. It is perhaps fitting that this turbulent chapter in human history is remembered as the Dark Ages, a time when the light of learning and progress dimmed, and the basest impulses of greed, cruelty, and violence so often carried the day. And yet, for all the savagery of their times, these tragic royals still exert a unique fascination centuries later. Their lives and deaths offer a window into an age so very different from our own, but one where the fundamental questions of power, ambition, and human frailty remain timeless. So as we close the book on these ill-starred rulers, take a moment to reflect on the vanity of power, the betrayals of the heart, and the fleeting nature of life itself. Pleasant dreams. The grisly execution of Gunther von Schwarzburg serves as a stark reminder of the ruthless power struggles that characterized the Holy Roman Empire in the 14th century. But as we've seen, it was far from the only example of a royal figure meeting a brutal end in medieval Europe. The lives of kings and queens were constantly under threat, not only from external enemies, but also from those closest to them, their own family members. Perhaps no story illustrates this better than the fate of Ermengarde of Anjou, a woman whose thirst for vengeance against her own daughter-in-law led to her suffering one of the most chilling deaths imaginable. Born around 956 AD into the powerful House of Anjou in what is now Western France, Ermengarde was a formidable figure from a young age. She married Henry I, Duke of Burgundy, and bore him several children, including the future King Robert II of France. As Robert ascended to the French throne in 996 AD, Ermengarde became Queen Mother, a role that granted her significant influence over the royal court. However, her power was threatened when Robert took a new wife, the beautiful and ambitious Constance of Arles. Despite being the daughter of the Count of Arles, Constance was from a rival dynasty, and Ermengarde saw her as an upstart who needed to be put in her place. The animosity between the two women quickly escalated into a bitter feud that threatened to tear the French royal family apart. Ermengarde accused Constance of adultery and convinced King Robert to have his wife locked away in a monastery. But the young queen would not be cowed so easily. She managed to escape her captivity and rally an army of supporters to her side, sparking a civil war against her own husband and mother-in-law. In a shocking turn of events, Ermengarde was captured by Constance's forces in battle. The vindictive queen decided to subject her rival to the most humiliating death possible. Ermengarde was thrown into a deep, dark dungeon beneath the earth, deprived of all food and water, and left to slowly starve to death. It was a fate that she had once wished upon Constance, but now the tables had turned in the most ironic and horrifying way imaginable. As the days turned to weeks, Ermengarde languished in the dank, filthy cell, growing weaker and more delirious with each passing hour. The once proud and powerful Queen Mother was reduced to a pitiful shell of her former self, her body racked by the agonizing pains of prolonged hunger. One can only imagine the despair and regret that must have filled her mind in those final moments, as she confronted the bitter realization that her own ruthless scheming had led her to this miserable end. Finally, in 1032 AD, after enduring unimaginable suffering, Ermengarde succumbed to starvation and passed from this world. Her gruesome fate sent shockwaves through the French court and became a cautionary tale for generations of royals to come. It was a stark reminder that even the most powerful figures were not immune to the consequences of their own cruelty and ambition. The story of Ermengarde of Anjou is a haunting example of the vicious cycle of vengeance that so often characterized medieval dynastic politics. In a world where power was everything and mercy was in short supply, even the bonds of family could be twisted into instruments of unthinkable brutality. As we come to the end of our journey through some of the most disturbing royal deaths of the Middle Ages, it's worth reflecting on the harsh realities of life in those turbulent times. From the torture chambers of England to the poisoned courts of Italy, danger lurked around every corner for those born to wear a crown. But perhaps what's most striking is the sheer variety of gruesome fates that befell these ill-starred monarchs. Some, like Edward II, met their end through acts of shocking violence that still have the power to horrify us centuries later. Others, like Charles VI, fell victim to the ravages of mental illness, their once promising reigns devolving into chaos and despair. Still others, like Joanna the Friar of Naples, found themselves caught up in the tangled webs of international intrigue, their lives cut short by the machinations of foreign powers. And some, like Gunther von Schwarzburg, were simply unlucky enough to find themselves on the losing side of history, their brief moments in the sun extinguished in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Through it all, one thing remains constant: the precariousness of power in a world where violence and betrayal were a way of life. For the kings and queens of medieval Europe, the trappings of royalty, the crowns, the thrones, the grand palaces and glittering jewels offered little protection against the perils that lurked around every corner. Theirs was a world where even the mightiest could be brought low in an instant, where the line between life and death was as thin and fragile as a gossamer veil. It's a sobering thought to contemplate as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with images of the grisly ends met by these long-dead royals. But perhaps there's a strange sort of comfort in it as well. The knowledge that for all the challenges and anxieties of our modern lives, we are blessed to live in a time where such brutal fates are the stuff of history books, rather than daily realities. So let us bid farewell to the tortured shades of Edward II, Charles VI, Joanna I, Gunther von Schwarzburg, Ermengarde of Anjou, and all the other tragic figures we've encountered on this dark and twisted journey through the annals of royal history. May they find in death the peace and rest that so often eluded them in life. And may we, the living, learn from their stories and strive to build a world where such cruelty and suffering are nothing more than distant memories. As you slip deeper into the realm of dreams, let your mind wander back through the centuries, to a time when kings and queens held the fate of nations in their hands. Picture the grand castles and soaring cathedrals, the glittering courts and bloody battlefields. Imagine the faces of the monarchs we've met, some twisted in agony, others serene in repose. But most of all, hold fast to the knowledge that for all the darkness and despair we've encountered on this journey, there is still light to be found in the human spirit. In the courage of a young queen who refused to submit to her tormentors, in the resilience of a troubled king who clung to sanity against all odds, in the determination of a pretender who dared to dream of greatness, even in the face of certain defeat. These are the stories that echo through the ages, the tales of triumph and tragedy that remind us of the enduring power of the human will. And as we drift off to sleep, let us carry them with us into the land of dreams. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and humanity can still shine through. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be filled with the romance and adventure of ages past, unsullied by the grim realities we've faced together this evening. And may you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face the challenges of a new day with the same courage and resolve as the kings and queens of old. Until next time, this is your faithful guide through the annals of history, bidding you a fond farewell. Sleep well, and may the past be but a distant memory as you journey forth into the bright promise of tomorrow. Our next ill-fated monarch, Charles VI of France, inherited his throne at the tender age of 11 in 1380. Charles showed much promise in his youth, described as handsome, charming, and intelligent. He earned the nickname Charles the Beloved for his generosity and popularity with the people. But this promising reign was not to last. In 1392, at the age of 23, Charles suddenly began exhibiting signs of paranoid schizophrenia. While marching with his army through a forest, the king abruptly attacked his own knights, killing several before he could be subdued. From that day on, he suffered bouts of insanity, amnesia, and delusions, at times even believing he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. Charles's madness left him prey to manipulation by his ruthless uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans, who ruled in his stead as regents and battled each other for control of the kingdom. The king himself was often neglected, left alone in his filth and squalor during his periods of insanity. As the years went on, Charles's condition only worsened. He often failed to recognize his own wife and children. He flew into wild rages, refused to bathe or change his clothes, and even bit and clawed at his own flesh. The once great kingdom of France descended into chaos and civil war under this mad king, incapable of ruling or even fully comprehending his own identity. Charles suffered his final attack of madness in 1422 and died shortly thereafter at the age of 53, though not from natural causes, some whispered. Rumours swirled that the king had been poisoned or smothered in his bed, assassinated by those eager to clear the way for a new ruler that could pull France out of the mire. Though the truth of these allegations remains uncertain, what is clear is that Charles VI's impaired reign left France vulnerable and fractured. The country soon found itself overrun by the invading armies of England, led by King Henry V in the throes of the 100 Years' War. It would take a heroine of mythic proportions, Joan of Arc, to rally the French and lead them to victory against the English. But that's a story for another time. For now, picture, if you will, the sad figure of Charles VI, a once gallant king reduced to a raving shell of a man, draped in rags, railing at phantoms only he could see. His is the tragic tale of a mind crumbled under the weight of a crown, a potent reminder that even the mightiest of rulers are not immune to the frailties of the human psyche. And yet, more deadly intrigue awaited the royals of medieval Europe, as the fate of our next doomed sovereign, Joanna I of Naples, attests. Born in 1325, Joanna was the eldest daughter of Charles, Duke of Calabria and heir to the Neapolitan throne. From an early age, she was renowned for her beauty, intellect, and forceful personality. When her father and grandfather both died in quick succession, 19-year-old Joanna found herself Queen of Naples and one of the most powerful women in Europe. She would rule in her own right for nearly 40 tumultuous years. But Joanna's reign was marred by scandal from the very start. She had been married at a young age to her cousin Andrew, son of the King of Hungary. It was an unhappy union, with Andrew widely disliked by the Neapolitan court for his arrogance and foreign ways. In 1345, just 2 years into Joanna's reign, Andrew was brutally murdered, his body found strangled and defenestrated from a window of the Queen's apartments. Rumour quickly spread that Joanna herself had ordered the killing so that she could marry her lover, Louis of Taranto. Facing accusations and threats of invasion from Andrew's enraged Hungarian relatives, Joanna took flight to Avignon, where she charmed Pope Clement VI and convinced him of her innocence. The Pope annulled her marriage to the deceased Andrew, sanctioned her union with Louis of Taranto, and formally cleared her of involvement in her husband's murder. But though she escaped official conviction, suspicions of Joanna's guilt would dog her for the rest of her days. Her reign, while marked by patronage of the arts and scholarship, was constantly roiled by dynastic intrigues, shifting alliances, and the vengeance of her Hungarian in-laws. That vengeance would finally catch up to Joanna in 1382. While staying at a castle near Naples, the 54-year-old queen was reportedly poisoned, then pushed from a window and strangled to death with a silken cord on the orders of her nephew, Charles of Durazzo. Charles, supported by the King of Hungary, seized the Neapolitan throne, ending nearly 2 centuries of rule by the Capetian House of Anjou. So concluded the dramatic life and notorious death of Joanna I, the medieval queen whose scandalous reputation and grim fate captured the popular imagination of her age and beyond. Hers is a sordid tale of murder, rumour, and revenge most royal, a web of courtly intrigue with a deadly poisonous spider at its centre. From inglorious rulers to regal downfalls, we turn now to a more obscure figure in the annals of ill-fated royalty, Gunther von Schwarzburg, the would-be Holy Roman Emperor, whose reach for glory was cut brutally short. In the chaotic imperial politics of the 14th century Germany, Gunther was an unexpected upstart challenger. A minor noble from Thuringia, he threw his helmet into the ring in January 1349, when he was elected anti-king by a group of discontented princes opposed to the reigning emperor, Charles IV of Luxembourg. Just 30 years old and described as handsome and dashing, Gunther must have seemed the perfect figurehead for a rebellion. But in truth, he was little more than a political pawn in a much deadlier game of thrones. Gunther's reign, such as it was, lasted a mere 5 months. After rallying what supporters he could, he marched with his makeshift army to Frankfurt, where he hoped to be formally crowned in opposition to Charles IV. But he would not even make it to the city gates. Charles moved swiftly to crush this princely revolt, his forces intercepting Gunther and routing his men near the village of Eltville. Gunther himself was captured and dragged back to Charles's camp. There, he was made to publicly renounce his claim to the throne and declare his loyalty to the emperor. But his humiliation was only beginning. Not content with a mere oath of fealty, Charles made a brutal example of the young usurper. On May 26, 1349, before a crowd of shocked onlookers, Gunther was stripped naked, broken on the wheel, drawn and quartered, and finally beheaded. In a final macabre gesture, Charles had Gunther's body parts displayed in towns across Germany as a gruesome warning to any other would-be challengers to his imperial power. And so, Gunther von Schwarzburg, the gallant young king who never was, met a fate so grisly it would make even the most hardened medieval courtier blanch. It's a strange quirk of history that we know so little of Gunther the man, and yet so much of Gunther the mutilated corpse. In the end, he was but a briefly flickering spark of ambition, snuffed out by the cold realpolitik of an emperor's unchecked power, an evocative emblem of the price of failed rebellion in an age when royalty ruled with ruthlessly iron fists. Shifting our gaze from the intrigues of the Holy Roman Court, we find our next tragic tale of royal murder hits much closer to home. For even the most intimate familial bonds were no guard against the murderous machinations of medieval monarchs and their kin, as the grim fate of Ermengarde of Anjou attests. Born around 956 AD into the powerful French dynasty of the Counts of Anjou, Ermengarde was a formidable figure in her own right. She married Conan Thus, Duke of Brittany, and bore him 4 children before he died in 992. As regent for their young son Geoffrey, Ermengarde proved a capable ruler, fending off rebellions and governing the duchy with a firm hand. But it was Ermengarde's second marriage in 996 to Robert II, the pious but easily led King of France, that would prove her undoing. Robert was already wed to a woman named Rosala, but he cast her aside to marry the wealthy and well-connected Ermengarde instead. The marriage produced 2 daughters, Hedwig and Adela. While Robert doted on his new bride, a rift soon opened between Ermengarde and her beautiful young daughter-in-law, Constance of Arles. Perhaps envious of Constance's youth and influence over Robert, Ermengarde reportedly treated the young queen cruelly, even accusing her of adultery and convincing the king to banish her to a nunnery. But Ermengarde underestimated her foe. The fiery Constance escaped her confinement, rallied allies to her side, and raised an army to besiege Paris and depose her husband and hated mother-in-law. Robert, fearing for his throne, was forced to reconcile with his wife and placate her supporters. It was a humiliating defeat for Ermengarde, but one that would pale in comparison to the vindictive retribution awaiting her. During the chaos of the revolt, she was captured by Constance's men and dragged in chains before the furious young queen. As chroniclers tell it, Constance ordered Ermengarde locked deep in an underground dungeon, where not a ray of sun nor a glimmer of light could enter. There, the deposed Queen Mother was left to waste away, denied all food and human contact, until she finally perished of hunger and despair on March 25th, 1032. It's a shudder-inducing glimpse into the vicious cycle of courtly rivalries that could consume even the closest of royal relations. One imagines the once proud Ermengarde shivering alone in the dank bowels of her own castle, the same woman who had terrorized her own daughter-in-law, now left with only the cold comfort of knowing she'd been outdone by a crueler schemer than herself. Hers is a tale to make one grateful for the tamer family squabbles of modern life. For who among us hasn't endured the cutting remarks of a surly mother-in-law at Thanksgiving dinner? But for Ermengarde, the stakes of such domestic discord were life and death. Her punishment not an icy glare, but an airless oubliette. In the fatal rivalries of the medieval court, it seems, not even blood ties were thicker than the regal thirst for vengeance. As our foray into the shocking royal demises of the Middle Ages draws to a close, we're reminded once more of the precariousness of even the most exalted lives in this turbulent era. Kings and queens may have been the earthly embodiment of wealth, status, and power, but they were hardly immune to the mortal perils stalking their palaces and parlours. Indeed, in some ways, a crown was more curse than blessing, painting a bright target on royal backs for the daggers and poisons of countless covetous schemers. The same privileges that elevated monarchs above the common rabble also rendered their every move fraught with suspicion and risk. Even the softest royal pillow could conceal a viper. In the end, the royal stars of the medieval world flickered out much like those of more ordinary men, in sickness and pain, in loneliness and squalor, in terror and treachery. The same vaulted castle walls built to safeguard their majesty crumbled just as easily to cage them in extremis. And yet, in the fickle workings of history, it is these scandalous and operatic downfalls that echo through the centuries, capturing the fascination of generations. For there is perhaps a touch of schadenfreude in hearing of the great laid low, in knowing that even the mightiest among us cannot escape the gravity of our shared mortal coil. These medieval tales of royal murder and misfortune, then, serve as a memento mori of sorts, a piquant reminder to we mere peasants to savour our humbler yet safer stations. So let us dream of simpler lives, free from the crushing weight of crowns as we drift off tonight, giving thanks for covers unbloodied by courtly machinations. And with that, we bid a restful good night to the star-crossed sovereigns of ages past, and to you, dear listener. May your slumber be free from the intrigues of the boudoir and the barbarity of the throne room. For in the end, there are worse fates than that of the overlooked serf. A straw mattress may be meagre, but at least no one is plotting to smother you with it. Sweet dreams. In our exploration of the shocking fates that befell medieval monarchs, we turn now to the grim tale of Charles VI, the Mad King of France. Born in 1368, Charles was the son of King Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon. As a young prince, he showed great promise, handsome, athletic, and well liked by the people for his generosity and charm. When he ascended to the throne at the tender age of 11, there was every reason to believe that he would grow into a capable ruler who would lead France into a glorious new era. But fate had other plans for young Charles. The first signs of trouble emerged in 1392, when the 24-year-old king suffered a sudden and terrifying mental breakdown. According to contemporary accounts, it happened while he was leading his army through a forest on a sweltering August day. Without warning, Charles flew into a fit of madness, drawing his sword and attacking his own men, killing several before he could be subdued. From that day forward, he was plagued by recurring bouts of insanity that transformed him from a promising young ruler into a haunted shell of a man. During his lucid periods, Charles could still function somewhat normally, presiding over the royal court and even fathering several children with his long-suffering wife, Isabeau of Bavaria. But his episodes of madness grew increasingly bizarre and debilitating. At times, he would lapse into a catatonic stupor, refusing to eat, bathe, or even move for days on end. Other times, he would run howling through the palace, or lie on the floor, gnawing at the rushes like a wild animal. Most disturbingly of all, he became gripped by the delusion that his body was made of glass and could shatter at any moment, a paranoid fantasy that left him paralyzed with fear. As the king descended deeper into insanity, the once vibrant French court became a grim and joyless place. Queen Isabeau withdrew into her own private world of extravagance and excess, while Charles's uncles ruthlessly jockeyed for power behind the scenes. The kingdom itself began to slide into chaos and civil war, as rival factions sought to fill the vacuum left by the mad king on the throne. Most alarming of all was the rising threat of the English, who sensed weakness and pressed their claims to the French crown ever more aggressively. The final years of Charles VI's reign were a blur of madness, intrigue, and bloodshed. By 1420, he had lost all grip on reality and was little more than a hollow figurehead, a once great king now reduced to a babbling wreck who had to be spoon-fed by his attendants. When he finally died in 1422 at the age of 53, it was less a tragedy than a mercy. The official cause was listed as dysentery, but many whispered that the king had been poisoned, smothered, or simply allowed to waste away, put out of his misery by those who hoped to see a saner hand on the reins of power. In the end, though, Charles's death brought no respite to his troubled kingdom. France was more fractured and vulnerable than ever, torn between the machinations of the king's conniving relatives and the looming threat of English conquest. In a bitter twist of irony, the demise of the mad king set the stage for the rise of a peasant girl who would rally the nation and change the course of history, a girl named Joan of Arc. But that is a tale for another time. For now, let us bid farewell to poor Charles VI, a king whose reign began with such bright promise, only to descend into darkness and chaos. His is a tragically vivid reminder of the razor-thin line between greatness and madness that so many medieval monarchs were forced to walk. In the unforgiving world of royal power politics, it took only one sudden twist of fate, one hidden defect of the mind, to transform a leader into a liability, or a life into a living death. As we lie here in the gathering dark, let our minds drift back through the centuries to a time when even the mightiest could fall victim to the mysterious workings of the human psyche. A time when donning a crown meant opening oneself up to all the perils of power, both from without and from within. Ponder for a moment the strange and tragic tale of the Glass King of France, and be grateful for the simple sanity of our own quiet beds. But Charles VI was hardly the only medieval monarch to meet a dark and disquieting end. Another king who suffered a shockingly brutal demise was Edward II of England, though the exact circumstances of his downfall remain wreathed in grim legend and mystery. Edward's short and troubled reign began in 1307, when he ascended to the throne at the age of 23. The son of the great warrior king Edward I, he had big shoes to fill, but from the start it was clear that he was cut from a very different cloth than his formidable father. Where Edward the Hind had been a fierce and decisive ruler, expanding his kingdom through ceaseless military campaigns, His son was a flighty and frivolous man who cared more for earthly pleasures than the burdens of kingship. Chief among Edward II's flaws was his tendency to lavish favour and power on a succession of unpopular male favourites. First a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, and later a pair of ambitious barons named Hugh le Despencer and his son. These men, whom many saw as arrogant upstarts, wielded an unhealthy degree of influence over the king, stoking resentment among the established nobility. Gaveston, in particular, made a deadly enemy in Edward's powerful cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, who saw himself as the rightful power behind the throne. As Edward frittered away his reign on feasting, hunting, and other indulgences, his kingdom began to crumble around him. He suffered a humiliating military defeat at the hands of Robert the Bruce, effectively losing control of Scotland. His own barons rose up in open rebellion, briefly forcing him to exile Gaveston, only for the king to recall his beloved companion and set the stage for a bloody civil war. The final blow came in 1326, when Edward's estranged queen, Isabella of France, conspired with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to overthrow the king and place their young son on the throne. Edward was captured and forced to abdicate in favour of the 14-year-old Edward III. He spent the final months of his life as a prisoner in Berkeley Castle, at the not-so-tender mercies of his wife's henchmen. It is here that the story takes a truly macabre turn. According to one particularly lurid account, recorded by the 14th century chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, Edward met his end in a shockingly brutal fashion by having a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, burning out his internal organs. This grisly tale has captured the popular imagination for centuries, but many historians now dismiss it as a scurrilous rumour spread by the king's enemies to blacken his name. More likely, Edward was quietly done away with in some less flamboyant fashion, perhaps smothered with a pillow, or simply left to waste away from neglect and despair. But whatever the truth of his demise, there is no denying the dark poetry of the red-hot poker legend, a vivid symbol of the searing pain and humiliation that marked this fallen king's final days. In the end, Edward II's reign was less a tragedy than a cautionary tale, a reminder of the perils of weak and irresponsible leadership. He was a man who had every advantage of birth and fortune, but squandered it all on frivolous pursuits and fawning favoritism. In a world where kings were expected to be warriors and statesmen, he was an embarrassment, a feckless dilettante who let his kingdom fall to ruin. But perhaps there is a touch of sympathy to be found for Edward as well. He was, after all, only human, a man with flaws and weaknesses, thrust into a role he was singularly unsuited for. In his own way, he was as much a prisoner as he was a king, trapped by the expectations of his bloodline, the machinations of his enemies, and the unforgiving judgments of history. As we let ourselves drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for poor, doomed Edward II, a man who reached for the pleasures of life and ended up grasping only the red-hot agony of death. May we all be grateful for our simpler fates and the quiet comfort of our humble dreams. But Edward and Charles were far from the only medieval monarchs to meet a grim and grisly end. Another royal figure, whose demise was steeped in mystery and malevolence, was Joanna I, Queen of Naples, a woman who wielded great power and influence in her own right, only to fall victim to the ruthless intrigues of the age. Born in 1326, Joanna was the eldest granddaughter of Robert the Wise, King of Naples, a cultured and ambitious ruler who sought to make his kingdom a centre of art and learning. When Robert died in 1343, he left his throne to the 17-year-old Joanna, making her one of the most eligible royal bachelorettes in Europe. Her first marriage, to her cousin Andrew of Hungary, was a loveless match arranged for political reasons, and it would prove to be her undoing. From the start, Andrew was deeply unpopular with the Neapolitan court. He was seen as a boorish foreigner with no appreciation for the kingdom's refined culture, and his heavy-handed attempts to assert his own authority only alienated him further. Joanna, meanwhile, was a cultured and sophisticated queen who patronized artists and poets, and who chafed at her husband's clumsy efforts to control her. The tensions between the royal couple came to a head in 1345, when Andrew was found dead in the palace gardens, his body brutally beaten and strangled. Suspicion immediately fell on Joanna and her favourite courtiers, who were rumoured to have had a hand in the murder. But the young queen was a shrewd operator, and she acted quickly to shore up her position. Fleeing to the papal court in Avignon, Joanna used her considerable charms to win over Pope Clement VI, who had the power to absolve her of any wrongdoing. She returned to Naples in triumph, her enemies cowed, and her authority unquestioned. For the next 3 decades, she ruled as one of the most powerful and influential monarchs in Europe, using her wealth and alliances to expand her territories and cement her dynasty's grip on power. But Joanna's charmed life could not last forever. In 1382, at the age of 56, she met her own violent end, poisoned, according to some accounts, and then pushed from a window and strangled for good measure. The mastermind behind the plot was her nephew and rival, Charles of Durazzo, who had long coveted the Neapolitan throne for himself. With Joanna's death, the once mighty Capetian dynasty of Naples came to an abrupt and ignominious end. The kingdom fell into chaos as rival factions fought for control, and the neighbouring powers of Hungary and France moved in to claim their own slices of the pie. It was a bitter lesson in the precariousness of even the most seemingly unassailable royal power. For Joanna herself, though, there is perhaps a touch of defiant triumph to be found in her story. In an age when women were often seen as little more than political pawns, she had risen to become one of the most formidable rulers of her time, a queen who lived life on her own terms, and who refused to be cowed by the petty jealousies and machinations of men. As we let ourselves be lulled by the gentle currents of sleep, let us dream of Joanna the Foreign of Naples, a woman who reached for the stars, and who burned all the more brightly for the darkness that sought to extinguish her. In the grand tapestry of history, she remains a figure of enduring fascination, a reminder that even in the most treacherous of times, there is always room for greatness to shine through. And so we come to the end of our journey through the annals of royal misfortune, a winding path strewn with poison and plotting, treachery and tragedy. From the tormented Charles VI to the feckless Edward II, from the defiant Joanna I to the ruthless Ermengarde of Anjou, these monarchs stand as enduring reminders of the perils and pitfalls of power in a bygone age. In their stories, we catch a glimpse of a world very different from our own. A world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, even for those who wore the crown. It was a world where the line between glory and ruin was razor thin, and where even the mightiest could be brought low by the whims of fate or the machinations of their enemies. And yet, for all the darkness and brutality of these tales, there is something strangely compelling about them as well. In the grand drama of these ill-starred kings and queens, we see reflected the timeless struggles and yearnings of the human heart, the desire for greatness, the hunger for love and validation, the fear of betrayal and abandonment. In the end, perhaps that is what draws us to these stories. Even as we lie here in the comfort of our own beds, far removed from the intrigues and upheavals of ages past, we see in these doomed monarchs a glimmer of our own frailties and aspirations, our own hopes and fears. We are reminded that even the greatest among us are only human, subject to the same flaws and follies as the rest of us mortals. So let us drift off now into the welcome embrace of slumber, our minds filled with images of crown and castle, of love and loss, and the inexorable turning of fortune's wheel. Let the echoes of these long ago lives be the lullaby that carries us into the land of dreams, a gentle reminder of the fleeting nature of power and glory, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. And if, in the watches of the night, we should find ourselves haunted by visions of red-hot pokers or poisoned cups, of smothering pillows or sharpened blades, let us remember that these are but shadows of a distant past, spectres that cannot harm us in the safety of our own beds. For in the end, the only true power is the power of the present moment, the simple, sacred gift of breath and heartbeat, of the quiet spaces between our thoughts. So let us surrender now to the sweet oblivion of sleep, secure in the knowledge that we are held fast in the gentle arms of the here and now. Let the kings and queens of old fade into the mists of history, their sorrows and struggles no more than a half-remembered dream. And let us embrace the peace and stillness of this precious moment, as we drift ever deeper into the welcoming darkness. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be sweet and your slumber deep and untroubled. And may you wake in the morning to a world made new, washed clean of the blood and tears of ages past. For in the end, that is the only kingdom that truly matters, the kingdom of our own tranquil minds, at rest in the eternal present. And in that kingdom, may you reign supreme now and always. As the turbulent events unfolded at Berkeley Castle, while the grisly red-hot poker tale remains the most sensational account of Edward II's demise, other contemporary sources suggest alternative endings no less bleak. Some claim the disgraced king was cruelly smothered with heavy mattresses as he slept. Others whisper he wasted away from starvation, deprived of food and drink until he shriveled into a hollow husk of a man. Whichever dreadful fate snuffed out his life that fateful September in 1327, one truth is inescapable. The once mighty Edward of Caernarfon, King of England and Lord of Ireland, suffered a squalid and degrading death at the hands of his jailers, imprisoned, humiliated, and ultimately slain by the very people who were supposed to be his loyal subjects. It was a pitiable end for a man anointed by God to rule a kingdom. Edward's 20-year reign was plagued by military failures, political strife, and scandalous rumours about his relationships with male favourites like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. The barons resented the power and influence Edward lavished upon these upstart courtiers. His French queen Isabella despised him for flaunting his favourites and spurning her bed. Perhaps if Edward had been more adept at statecraft, or won magnificent victories on the battlefield against England's enemies, his nobles would have turned a blind eye to his proclivities. But this petulant, pleasure-seeking prince had proven a sorry disappointment as a ruler. He lost the crown jewel of Aquitaine and suffered a humiliating defeat to the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314. The kingdom fell into misrule and chaos as Edward and his evil counsellors alienated powerful peers and clergy. The tides of discontent surged into open rebellion when Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer raised an army to overthrow the king in 1326. Abandoned by his court and captured by Isabella's forces, Edward was forced to relinquish his crown to his teenage son, who became Edward III. The vanquished former king was carted off in chains to meet his doom at Berkeley Castle. Thus concluded the sordid saga of Edward II, who exchanged the resplendent robes of majesty for a prisoner's rags and a torturous death in a dank dungeon. A cautionary tale for future monarchs about the perils of alienating the political class and neglecting the duties of the crown. Edward II's lurid demise was an early omen of the carnage to come, as the Plantagenet dynasty devoured itself over the next century in the Wars of the Roses. Regime change in the Middle Ages was a blood-soaked affair, and not even anointed kings were safe from the madness. While few mourned the passing of Edward II, his gruesome end sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. A crowned and consecrated sovereign lord brutally cut down by traitors, It was an affront to the sacred laws of God and man that threatened the very foundations of monarchy. If it could happen to the King of England, were any of Christendom's rulers safe upon their thrones? The spectacle of regicide hinted at the first stirrings of a concept that would have once been unthinkable in feudal society, that the authority of the king should derive from the will of the nobility, not divine right alone. That birthright was not an absolute shield against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or the fatal consequences of misrule. Even God's anointed could fall to the earthy daggers of men. In death, Edward II served as a dark example to his successors, a blood-stained lesson in the importance of courting allies, rewarding loyalty, and ruthlessly crushing dissent. The folly of allowing overweening royal favourites to dominate government and alienate the old nobility. In time, Edward III would learn from the sins of the father as he restored the prestige of the English crown. But for now, England descended into turmoil as the boy king's regents jockeyed for power. As for Isabella and Mortimer, they soon reaped the whirlwind of their treachery. The young Edward III, upon entering his majority, had Mortimer hanged as a traitor and banished his own mother from court. In a realm where the daggers of power were ever drawn, the hand that thrust the blade could just as swiftly feel its sting. So closes the strange, sad tale of Edward of Caernarfon, the feckless English king hurled from his throne into a murderer's dungeon in a devil's bargain between his faithless wife and covetous barons. A feeble flame of a man snuffed out in the dark, leaving barely an ember behind to mark his passing. While Edward II's disastrous reign drifted into shadowed history, his shocking demise cast a long and grim shadow over England's political landscape. In 1399, his great-grandson Richard II met an eerily similar fate, deposed by rivals and left to rot in captivity, with whispered rumours that he was starved to death. The shades of fallen kings haunted the halls of power, macabre reminders of the ever-present peril of the crown. Over a century later, the Tudors still invoked the lurid regicide of Edward II to justify their iron-fisted grip on the realm. As the bard himself would pen in Richard II, "For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." The tragic tableau of a degraded ruler slain in a forlorn cell was a favourite propagandist trope of the age. But such are the cruel fates that stalked the royalty of the Middle Ages, where the crown was ever a capricious mistress, and the reaper an eager courtier. In those savage times, even the Lord's anointed could be cut down like chaff and cast into an unmarked grave. The unhappy shade of Edward II, the murdered king, wails out a mournful refrain to those troubled medieval centuries, that the paths of glory, in the end, lead but to the dungeon. And with that, we draw the shroud over Edward of Caernarfon and leave him to moulder in his cold grave, as we turn our eyes across the storm-tossed English Channel to another unfortunate monarch who met an unnatural end. The setting shifts to the soaring spires and gargoyle-shadowed halls of medieval Paris, where the next bleak chapter in our chronicle of royal murders shall unfold. There, we take up the tragic tale of Charles VI, the mad King of France, whose reign and reason unravelled beneath the gilded vaults of Notre Dame. And so we come to the end of our treacherous tour through the shocking fates that befell medieval monarchs. From the torturous demise of Edward II to the poisoning of Joanna I, the grisly execution of Gunther von Schwarzburg to the bitter starvation of Ermengarde of Anjou, these tragic tales remind us that even the most exalted royals were not immune to the perils and plots that pervaded palace life. In an age where power was so often seized and maintained through violence, it's perhaps no surprise that so many kings and queens met their ends in such brutal fashion. The cutthroat politics of succession, where rival claimants vied for the throne through warfare and assassination, made for a precarious existence at the best of times. And as we've seen, Even those who managed to ascend to the pinnacle of power could find themselves quickly toppled by scheming nobles, ambitious relatives, or even their own spouses. The medieval world was one where the line between monarch and prisoner could be crossed in the blink of an eye. One moment, you might be holding court in all your regal splendor. The next, you could be languishing in the dungeons, your crown and scepter replaced by chains and rags. Such was the fate of Edward II, whose disastrous reign ended in the humiliation of forced abdication and a horrific death at the hands of his captors. And even those rulers who managed to cling to power were often beset by enemies on all sides, forced to navigate a treacherous web of shifting alliances and simmering resentments. The mad king Charles VI of France, for all his early promise, found himself a pawn in the machinations of his cunning uncles, his bouts of insanity leaving him vulnerable to manipulation and ultimately, perhaps, murder. But it wasn't just external threats that medieval monarchs had to contend with. As the story of Ermengarde of Anjou shows, sometimes the greatest danger could come from within one's own family. The tale of this vengeful mother-in-law, who so hated her son's young bride that she was willing to see her starve to death, is a chilling reminder of the depths to which royal rivalries could sink. And let's not forget the sheer brutality of medieval justice, where even a whiff of disloyalty or threat to the established order could result in the most grisly of punishments. Poor Gunther von Schwarzburg, the would-be Holy Roman Emperor whose brief rebellion ended in torture, dismemberment, and the scattering of his body parts across Germany, a gruesome warning to any who dared challenge the might of the throne. But perhaps the most poignant of all these tragic tales is that of Joanna I of Naples, a woman who rose to become one of the most powerful and influential figures of her age, only to be cut down in her prime by the machinations of her enemies. The image of this brilliant queen, patron of the arts and champion of the poor, lying strangled on the floor of her own palace, is a sobering reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest of reigns. And yet, for all the darkness and brutality that suffused the lives of these ill-fated royals, there is still something strangely fascinating about their stories. Perhaps it's the sheer drama and intrigue of it all, the sense of lives lived on a grand and turbulent stage. Or maybe it's the glimpse they offer us into a world so different from our own, a realm of castles and crusades, of courtly love and chivalric valor. Whatever the reason, these tales of doomed kings and tragic queens have lost none of their power to captivate and enthrall us, even centuries after the last of their subjects have turned to dust. They remind us of the timeless nature of human ambition and frailty, of the heights to which we can soar and the depths to which we can plummet. And so, as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with visions of regal glory and courtly intrigues, let us spare a thought for these unfortunate royals, whose lives and deaths have become the stuff of legend. May they rest in peace, these once great rulers, now consigned to the pages of history, their tales a testament to the enduring fascination of power, passion, and the perils of the crown. But while the fates of these medieval monarchs may seem like the stuff of distant history, the themes that run through their stories are still all too relevant today. The struggle for power, the machinations of rivals and enemies, the precariousness of even the most exalted positions. These are all things that we can recognize in our own world, even if the specifics may have changed. In our own age of political turbulence and social upheaval, where leaders can rise and fall with dizzying speed, the tales of these doomed kings and queens take on a new resonance. They remind us of the fleeting nature of power, of the way that even the mightiest can be brought low by the twists and turns of fortune. And yet, there is something strangely comforting in these stories too. A sense that for all the chaos and conflict of the world, there is still a certain continuity to the human experience. The desires and fears, the triumphs and tragedies that shaped the lives of these long-dead royals are not so different from those that move us today. So perhaps, as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with the echoes of these ancient tales, we can take solace in the knowledge that we are not alone in our struggles and our dreams, that the great sweep of history is filled with figures both grand and terrible, whose lives and deaths have much to teach us about the nature of power, the perils of ambition, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. And who knows? Perhaps in the grand scheme of things, the fates of these medieval monarchs are not so different from our own. We may not wear crowns or wield scepters, but we all have our parts to play in the great drama of life, our own battles to fight, and our own legacies to leave. So let us take inspiration from the courage and determination of these long-ago rulers, even as we learn from their mistakes and their missteps. Let us strive to live our own lives with grace and purpose, secure in the knowledge that, no matter what fate may have in store for us, we are all part of a much greater story, a tapestry of human experience that stretches back through the ages and will continue long after we are gone. And with that thought, let us bid farewell to the doomed kings and tragic queens of the medieval world. Their tales a reminder of the enduring power of history to inspire, to caution, and to illuminate the human condition. May their stories live on in our hearts and minds, a testament to the timeless fascination of power, passion, and the perils of the crown. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey through the dark and twisted annals of medieval royal deaths. I hope that these tales of tragedy and intrigue have not disturbed your slumber too much, but have instead provided a glimpse into a world that, for all its strangeness and brutality, still holds a certain morbid fascination. For in the end, the stories of these ill-fated monarchs are not just about the grisly details of their demises, but about the enduring themes of power, ambition, and the fragility of human life. They remind us that, no matter how high we may rise or how grand our titles may be, we are all ultimately subject to the whims of fate and the machinations of those around us. But perhaps there is a strange sort of comfort to be found in that realization as well. For if even the mightiest of kings and queens could not escape the clutches of mortality, then surely we mere mortals need not be too hard on ourselves for our own failures and shortcomings. And so, as you drift off into the peaceful oblivion of sleep, let your mind wander back to the grand halls and grim dungeons of the medieval world, to the tales of mad kings and murderous queens, of poisoned chalices and red-hot pokers. But let these visions not trouble your dreams too deeply, for they are but echoes of a distant past, a reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the eternal cycle of life and death. Instead, take solace in the knowledge that, for all the darkness and despair that may have plagued the lives of these long-dead royals, there is still something strangely beautiful in their stories as well. A beauty that lies in the resilience of the human spirit, in the ability to endure even the most terrible of fates with courage and dignity. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. May the tales of these tragic monarchs linger in your thoughts, not as nightmares, but as reminders of the rich tapestry of human experience, the endless cycle of triumph and tragedy that makes up the grand drama of history. Rest well, and know that no matter what trials and tribulations may await you in the waking world, you are part of a much greater story. A story that has been unfolding since the dawn of time, and will continue long after we are all but dust and memory. A story of power and passion, of glory and despair, of the eternal struggle to find meaning and purpose in the face of an indifferent universe. And in that story, dear listener, you too have a part to play, a legacy to leave, no less grand or significant than those of the kings and queens of old. So embrace that role and face the challenges of life with the same courage and determination that these ill-fated royals showed in the face of their own grim fates. For in the end, It is not the manner of our passing that defines us, but the manner in which we live. And though the medieval world may seem like a distant and alien place, the lessons it has to teach us are as relevant now as they ever were. So let us take those lessons to heart and strive to live our lives with grace and purpose, secure in the knowledge that, no matter what fate may have in store for us, we are all part of something much greater than ourselves. A grand and glorious tapestry, woven from the threads of countless lives, each one a story unto itself, each one a glittering jewel in the crown of human history. And with that, dear listener, I bid you a final good night. May the echoes of these tales linger in your dreams, a reminder of the enduring power of the human spirit, the eternal cycle of life and death, and the timeless fascination of the crown and the sword. Sleep well, and know that you are part of a story that will endure long after we are all but forgotten. As we've seen, the gruesome fates of medieval monarchs like Edward II, Charles VI, Joanna I, and Ermengarde of Anjou illustrate the perilous existence of royalty in an age of rampant intrigue and violence. But if you think death by hot poker, starvation, or defenestration sounds unpleasant, just wait until you hear about the chilling end of Gunther von Schwarzburg, a 14th century German anti-king with the worst luck ever when it came to seizing power. Picture this. The year is 1349. The Holy Roman Empire is in turmoil. Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg is not exactly winning any popularity contests. Seeing an opportunity, the ambitious nobleman Gunther decides to make a play for the imperial throne. He manages to convince a few German princes to elect him as a rival anti-king. So far, so good, right? Well, Gunther's glory was short-lived, to put it mildly. Just a few months into his reign, Charles IV's forces soundly defeated him in battle near the city of Eltville. Gunther was captured and dragged before the vengeful emperor. Medieval justice was not known for its mercy, and Charles was determined to make an example of this upstart rival. What followed was one of the grisliest public executions in recorded history. First, Gunther's body was lashed to a large wooden wheel, bones shattered with an iron bar in the horrific punishment known as breaking on the wheel. Already half dead, his mutilated body was then cut into 4 pieces, or quartered. As a final indignity, Gunther's head was chopped off and mounted on a spike. The bloody remains were displayed in towns across Germany as a gruesome warning to anyone else who dared challenge Charles IV's authority. And so ended the very brief and very unfortunate reign of Gunther von Schwarzburg, the hapless would-be Holy Roman Emperor. His story reminds us that failed power grabs in the Middle Ages tended to end in spectacular fashion. If you were going to come for the king, you'd better not miss. One wonders if Gunther had any inkling that his imperial ambitions would lead to such a grisly demise. But even a successful king could never feel too secure on his throne. Take the long and tragic reign of Charles VI of France, a promising young ruler whose sudden descent into madness threw his kingdom into chaos. When Charles took the crown in 1380, at the tender age of 11, he was by all accounts a charming and generous boy who inspired great affection in his subjects. He ruled ably for several years with the help of his uncle, the powerful Duke of Burgundy. But everything changed one fateful summer day in 1392, when the 23-year-old king was riding through a forest near Le Mans. Without warning, Charles suddenly drew his sword and began swinging it wildly at his entourage, shouting, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy!" Though his companions subdued him before he could do any harm, it soon became clear that something was seriously wrong with the king. He sank into a deep depression, refusing to eat, bathe, or change his clothes for months. At times he became catatonic, unable to move or speak. Other times he flew into fits of terrifying rage. Most disturbingly, Charles became gripped by strange delusions. believing that his body was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. Historians now believe that the young king was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness characterized by hallucinations, disorganized thoughts, and a total break from reality. In the superstitious medieval world, however, Charles's condition was blamed on everything from witchcraft to divine punishment. The royal physicians tried all sorts of bizarre treatments, from drilling holes in his skull to dosing him with pulverized pearls, unicorn horn, and potions made from distilled human blood. Needless to say, none of it helped. As Charles VI descended deeper into insanity, his kingdom fell into disarray. Ambitious uncles and cousins vied for control over the mad king, using him as a pawn in their power struggles. The government was paralyzed, the treasury depleted. Seeing an opportunity, England's King Henry V invaded France in 1415, kicking off decades of ruinous war. A once promising reign had disintegrated into chaos and bloodshed. Charles VI spent his final years as a raving shadow king, a hollow shell of his former self. When he finally died in 1422 at the age of 53, many whispered that it was not from natural causes. Some claimed that his wife, Queen Isabeau, had smothered him with a pillow to put him out of his misery. Others believed his son, Charles VII, had poisoned him to clear the way for his own succession. The truth remains lost to history, but one thing is certain: it was a sad and ignominious end for a ruler who had once shimmered with such potential. The tale of Charles VI is a reminder of the ever-present spectre of madness that haunted medieval monarchs. In an age before psychiatry, mental illness was deeply misunderstood and stigmatized. For a king to descend into insanity was seen as a catastrophe, a sign that he had lost divine favor. It left him vulnerable to manipulation and conspiracy, his kingdom ripe for ruin. But as we've seen, even a sane and shrewd ruler could find herself at the mercy of her scheming relatives. Just ask Joanna the Fauve, the brilliant and formidable Queen of Naples, whose death remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 14th century. By all accounts, Joanna was an extraordinary woman. Inheriting the throne at the age of 19, she ruled her kingdom with intelligence and skill for nearly 40 years. She was a renowned patron of the arts, surrounding herself with poets, painters, and scholars. Her court was one of the most splendid in Europe, glittering with wealth and beauty. But Joanna's reign was plagued by scandal from the start. Her first husband was her cousin Andrew, a boorish and unpopular Hungarian prince. When Andrew was found strangled to death just 2 years into their marriage, suspicion immediately fell on Joanna. Rumour had it that the young queen had grown tired of her oafish husband and plotted with her lover to have him murdered. Facing a revolt from Andrew's outraged Hungarian relatives, Joanna fled to Avignon and threw herself on the mercy of Pope Clement VI. Using her considerable charm and intellect, she convinced the pontiff of her innocence and persuaded him to grant her a formal acquittal. Joanna returned to Naples in triumph, her enemies cowed into submission. But the wily queen had underestimated the long memory and thirst for vengeance of the Hungarians. In 1382, nearly 40 years after Andrew's death, Joanna died under very suspicious circumstances at Muro Castle. According to some accounts, Hungarian assassins disguised as pilgrims infiltrated the castle and pushed the queen from a window. As she lay bleeding on the ground, they strangled her with a silken cord. Other versions claim Joanna was poisoned first to weaken her struggles. Whatever the exact details, it seems clear that Joanna's grisly murder was an act of belated retaliation by King Louis I of Hungary, Andrew's brother. He had never forgiven Joanna for his younger sibling's untimely death and saw a chance to finally exact his revenge while asserting Hungarian claims to the Neapolitan throne. After 4 decades of glorious rule, Joanna's death plunged her kingdom into crisis and left it vulnerable to foreign conquest. one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, brought low by an implacable family feud. It's a story as old as time, with a bloody medieval twist. Joanna's murder is a reminder of the limits of even the most brilliant queen's power in the face of determined enemies. In the end, she was perhaps a victim of her own success. A woman who dared to rule in her own right in a world that still believed crowns belonged to men. And if you think that's the only princess who ran afoul of a murderous in-law, think again. Let me tell you about Constance of Arles, a 11th century French queen whose battle with her husband's mother gives a whole new meaning to the phrase monster-in-law. When Constance married Robert II, the young king of France, in 1003, she thought she'd landed the catch of a lifetime. Renowned as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, Constance was rich, royal, and a shoo-in to be Queen Mother someday. There was just one problem: Robert's mother, the imperious Dowager Queen Ermengarde of Anjou. From the moment Constance arrived at the French court, Ermengarde despised her. Possibly jealous of the younger woman's beauty and influence over Robert, Ermengarde spread vicious rumours that the new queen was sleeping around behind the king's back. She hissed to anyone who would listen that Constance's first child was a bastard, the product of an illicit affair. For years, Ermengarde waged a quiet campaign of sabotage against her daughter-in-law, poisoning Robert's mind against his bride. Finally, when the king was on his deathbed in 1031, the embittered Dowager Queen seized her chance. She convinced her dying son that Constance was a harlot who would corrupt their children. Ermengarde browbeat Robert into disinheriting his sons and locking Constance away in a nunnery to live out her days in disgrace. But Ermengarde had underestimated her daughter-in-law's resourcefulness. Constance escaped her confinement and fled to her family's lands in Provence. There she raised an army and marched on Paris, determined to take back her crown and her children. What followed was one of the most vicious mother-in-law, daughter-in-law showdowns in history. Constance laid siege to Ermengarde's strongholds, the two women's armies clashing across the French countryside in a series of bloody skirmishes. Finally, Constance's forces captured Ermengarde and dragged her before the furious queen. According to legend, Constance had her nemesis thrown into a deep dungeon beneath the palace, an oubliette from which there was no escape. Ermengarde was left there to starve, with nothing but mouldy crusts of bread and sips of stagnant water to sustain her. As she lay dying in the darkness, she must have reflected bitterly on the folly of underestimating the woman she'd so hated and wronged. Constance, for her part, emerged victorious and uncontested as regent for her young sons. She would rule France ably for many years, her power and reputation restored. The ultimate girl boss of the Middle Ages, if you will. So, there you have it. 5 of the most shockingly brutal ends met by medieval monarchs, from the torturous death of Edward II to the gruesome execution of Gunther von Schwarzburg, the mysterious murder of Joanna I, and the madness of Charles VI, to the vicious mother-in-law, daughter-in-law feud that sealed Ermengarde of Anjou's doom. These stories are a reminder of just how precarious power could be in the Middle Ages, even for those who wore the crown. In an age of rampant superstition, ceaseless war, and shifting alliances, a ruler was only as secure as their grip on the loyalty of their court and subjects. And as these chilling tales demonstrate, even that was sometimes not enough to save a king or queen from a horrifically violent demise. Of course, not every medieval monarch came to such a grisly end. Many lived long and relatively stable lives, ruling their kingdoms as best they could in difficult times. But the ever-present possibility of betrayal, madness, and murder lurked behind every tapestry, turning glittering palaces into perilous places where death could strike at any moment. In a way, these doomed kings and queens are almost more fascinating because of their tragic fates. Their lives and deaths offer us a glimpse into the darkest corners of the medieval world, where the clash of ambitions and the whims of fortune could bring even the most powerful rulers to their knees. The red-hot poker, the wooden wheel, the silken garrote, the poisoned chalice, the starving oubliette, these were the perils of a throne in a dangerous time. They're also the stuff of the most captivating and, let's be honest, morbidly entertaining history. Because as much as we may recoil at the grisliness of it all, there's something undeniably compelling about these tales of royals who met their ends in the most shocking and macabre of ways. Perhaps it's the reminder that even the mightiest among us are, in the end, only human, vulnerable to the same flaws, fears and failures as the rest of us. Or maybe it's just the timeless thrill of a juicy, bloody story full of gore and guts and palace intrigue. Either way, the deadly dramas of medieval monarchs continue to fascinate us centuries later, inviting us to lose ourselves in a world at once impossibly distant and strangely familiar. So as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for the doomed kings and queens of the Middle Ages, those tragic players on the great stage of history, whose lives and deaths still captivate us today. May your dreams be a bit more peaceful than their ends. The promise of a throne in medieval Europe was a double-edged sword. The lives of kings and queens were often cut brutally short by the very power they sought to wield. The quest for royal supremacy all too frequently ended in murder most foul. Our first tragic tale is that of Edward II, one of England's most disastrous rulers. Born in 1284 to the masterful King Edward I, young Edward was the very opposite of his warrior father. He far preferred the pleasures of music, theatre, and the company of his male favourites to the arts of war and governance. From the start of his reign in 1307, Edward II blundered his way from one fiasco to the next. He enraged England's powerful barons by showering wealth and influence on his companion, Piers Gaveston. When military campaigns against Scotland ended in humiliating defeat, the fuming nobility forced Edward to send Gaveston into exile. The unpopular Gaveston was eventually captured and executed by the barons in 1312. But Edward failed to learn his lesson. He sank into indolence and allowed a new crop of corrupt courtiers to dominate his rule, led by the avaricious Hugh Despenser. As their influence grew and Edward's ineptitude deepened, a rebellion brewed. It was led by none other than his furious French wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. By 1326, the rebels had seized control. They forced Edward to abdicate in favour of his teenage son, who became King Edward III. The humiliated former king was imprisoned at the remote Berkeley Castle and placed under the not-so-tender care of jailers with an axe to grind. According to a grisly account penned a decade later, Edward's murderers crept into the castle on the night of September 21st, 1327. The helpless captive was held down, a horn forced into his rectum, and a red-hot poker shoved through it, burning his bowels from the inside. His agonized screams could be heard for miles around, the chronicler claimed. However, modern historians cast doubt on this shocking version of events. It was likely a piece of propaganda cooked up to stir outrage against Isabella and Mortimer's regime. Examination of Edward's funeral effigy shows no evidence of such torture. He more likely died from suffocation or starvation, a broken man brutally finished off by his vengeful queen. Though a terrible end for a terrible king, Edward II's ignoble demise pales in comparison to the madness and murder of another medieval monarch, Charles VI of France. Born in 1368, Charles was crowned at the tender age of 11. The early years of his reign were marked by the optimism of youth. Handsome, athletic and generous, Charles was well liked by his subjects and seemed destined for greatness. But tragedy struck without warning in the summer of 1392. While marching through a forest on a blisteringly hot day, the 23-year-old king suddenly snapped. He flew into a paranoid frenzy, attacking his own men and accusing them of treason. It soon became clear that the king's mind had shattered. He slipped into bouts of insanity, amnesia, and delusion. The worst of his psychotic episodes saw him refusing to bathe or change his clothes for months on end. He suffered from the delusion that his body was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. As Charles the Mad descended deeper into madness, his kingdom fell into chaos and civil strife. Ruthless uncles and cousins vied for power, manipulating the unwell king as a pawn in their schemes. Plague and famine scourged the land. France, once the jewel of Europe, lay paralyzed under a mentally ill monarch. After 30 long years of lunacy, Charles VI died in 1422 under suspicious circumstances. Some whispered he'd been poisoned by his own Queen Isabeau's lover. Others claimed he was smothered with a pillow. A quiet knife to put the sick old king out of his misery at last. No matter the method, the Mad King's death couldn't have come at a worse time. England's armies were already rampaging across northern France, led by the mighty Henry V. Charles's addled rule had left his country divided, bankrupt, and vulnerable to invasion. It would take a teenage peasant girl with visions of angels, Joan of Arc, to rally the French and turn the tide. But that's a tale for another time. For now, let's turn to the sunny shores of Italy and the untimely end of Joanna I, Queen of Naples. Born in 1326, Joanna was the eldest granddaughter of King Robert the Wise. A cultured patron of the arts and one of the richest women in Europe, she would grow up to be the most powerful queen in the history of Naples, ruling in her own right. However, her reign was marred by scandal from the very start. In 1345, Joanna's first husband Andrew, younger brother of the King of Hungary, was found brutally murdered in the gardens of their palace. Rumours flew that the young queen and her lovers were behind the assassination of the unpopular prince. Under a cloud of suspicion, Joanna fled to Avignon, where she deployed her considerable charms on Pope Clement VI. Dazzled by her beauty and intelligence, the pontiff cleared her of all wrongdoing and formally invested her with the Neapolitan crown. But Joanna's enemies in Hungary never forgot nor forgave. In 1382, they finally got their revenge. The 54-year-old queen had just sat down to dinner in her castle when a gang of Hungarian mercenaries burst in. They dragged her from the table, pushed her from an upper window, and strangled her to death with a silken cord. It was said she'd been poisoned first to weaken her resistance. Joanna's murder brought an end to the Capetian dynasty that had ruled Naples for nearly 2 centuries. Hungary's king invaded and seized control of the kingdom, claiming it as his own by right of revenge. The once glorious Queen Joanna was buried hastily and without ceremony, an ignominious end to a storied reign. But even her grim fate seems merciful compared to the ghastly execution of Gunther von Schwarzburg, a little-known 14th century German prince who made the fatal mistake of reaching too high. Born to a minor noble family in Thuringia, Gunther dreamed of rising to the pinnacle of power in the Holy Roman Empire. In 1349, he got his chance. A group of disgruntled German lords elected him as anti-king to challenge the unpopular Emperor Charles IV of Bohemia. Armed with this flimsy claim to legitimacy, Gunther raised an army and marched to battle against Charles. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. After just a few months of failed sieges and desertions, Gunther's forces were crushingly defeated near the city of Frankfurt. The would-be emperor was captured and hauled before a vengeful Charles IV for judgment. No mercy would be shown to this upstart rival. On Charles's orders, Gunther was subjected to the most brutal execution methods of the time. He was broken on the wheel, an agonizing ordeal that shattered the bones in his arms, legs, and back. Still clinging to life, he He was then drawn and quartered, his limbs ripped from their sockets by horses. Finally, he was beheaded, a grisly coup de grace. As a gruesome warning to any other pretenders, Gunther's mangled body parts were displayed in towns across Germany. His severed head was impaled on a spike above the gates of Frankfurt, where it remained for years as a macabre reminder of the price of failed ambition. But if you think only kings suffered such atrocious fates, think again. Even women wielding queenly power could meet nightmarish ends in the dog-eat-dog world of medieval monarchy. Just ask Ermengarde of Anjou, Duchess of Burgundy and mother-in-law from hell. Born around 970 AD into the powerful French dynasty of Anjou, Ermengarde was married off to the Duke of Burgundy as a teenager. She bore him 4 children, including the future King Robert II of France. A domineering mother, Ermengarde kept a firm grip on her royal son even after he took the throne. In 1003, much to his mother's enraged disapproval, Robert fell head over heels for the bewitching Constance of Arles and married her against Ermengarde's wishes. The Duchess seethed with resentment of her young daughter-in-law, who quickly replaced her as the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Ermengarde seized on rumours that Constance was having an affair. She convinced a gullible Robert that his wife had been unfaithful. In a rage, the king locked Constance up in the palace at Auxerre. But the fiery queen wasn't going down without a fight. She escaped her confinement and fled south to her homeland of Provence. There, she raised an army and launched a war against her own husband and mother-in-law, vowing revenge. Robert eventually reconciled with his wife, but Ermengarde was not so lucky. Constance's troops captured the loathed Duchess after the siege of Beaune. She was thrown into a deep dungeon and left to starve. As she wasted away in the flickering torchlight, did she regret her cruelty, her misplaced pride, or did she rage against her fate to her last breath? We can only imagine her thoughts as she perished alone in that black pit. A pitiless end to a pitiless woman. Perhaps the hunger clawing at her belly was a fitting punishment for the ravenous ambition that devoured her humanity. These are but a handful of the many sordid tales of royal murder in the Middle Ages. Each grim demise a reminder that the glittering crowns of kings and queens were too often knocked away to expose the worms and rot beneath. In the final accounting, the great Game of Thrones was a rigged one. A deadly jousting tourney where even the victors could find themselves suddenly impaled on the lance of misfortune. 1 minute, dining on golden plates. The next, thrashing on the executioner's block. Your blood soaking the velvet robes you once preened in. Perhaps there's a strange sort of equality to be found in that. Death, that great leveller, comes for pauper and prince alike. The reaper's skeletal hand is just as cold whether it's grabbing for a bejeweled scepter or a dirt-crusted beggar's bowl. And maybe there's an odd comfort to be taken in the knowledge that our modern troubles are but a shadow of the brutalities of old. The next time you find yourself lying in bed, fretting over some small worry, a credit card bill, an upcoming dental appointment, an awkward conversation with your boss, spare a thought for the tortured shades of Edward II, Charles VI, Joanna I, and the others. However bad your day has been, at least it didn't end with a red-hot poker up the rear. And on that cheery note, dear listener, I bid you sweet dreams. Let the soft arms of slumber cradle you. May your rest be undisturbed by visions of cracked crowns and bloody palace floors. Tomorrow is a new day, a new page, and I promise the next chapter of our tale will have a little less murder in it. Then again, this is the Middle Ages we're talking about. I'd hate to be accused of false advertising. Good night, my liege. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Or at least, may flights of avenging Hungarians refrain from pushing you out any windows. And cut. That's a wrap on medieval murder most foul. Sleep tight, fair listener. Don't let the royal bedbugs bite. The turbulent life and gruesome death of Charles VI of France provide a vivid illustration of just how precarious a monarch's grip on power, and on reality itself, could be in medieval times. Born in 1368, Charles was the son of King Charles V, known as Charles the Wise. Young Charles had an auspicious start, inheriting the throne at age 11 after his father's death in 1380. The early years of his reign showed much promise. Handsome, physically active, and generous, Charles VI was well liked by his subjects and earned the epithet Charles the Beloved. However, storm clouds were gathering. The teenage king faced challenges from his power-hungry uncles, who jostled for control of the regency government. And more troubling still were the first signs that not all was well with Charles's mind. It all came to a head one fateful summer day in 1392, when the 23-year-old Charles was leading his army through a forest near Le Mans. Without warning, the king suddenly flew into a terrifying fit of madness, drawing his sword and attacking his own men, killing several. His panicked entourage managed to subdue him and return him to Paris, but it was clear that France's king had lost his grip on sanity. This began a harrowing 30-year period of Charles VI's so-called mad reign. The king would suffer intermittent bouts of psychosis, alternating with periods of lucidity and remorse. During his breakdowns, he would rave nonsensically, fail to recognize his wife and children, and even suffer from the delusion that his body was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. Whenever the king lapsed into insanity, the apparatus of government would grind to a halt. Factions led by Charles' ruthless uncles battled for the regency, plunging France into chaos. The king's beautiful but much reviled Bavarian-born queen, Isabeau, faced accusations of adultery and witchcraft. There were times Charles did not recognize his own wife, shouting, "Who is this woman?" when she entered his presence. As France fractured, the rival dukes of Burgundy and Orléans fought a bloody civil war for control of the feeble king. The conflict left the country desperately weakened, ripe for invasion by the rival English. In 1415, Henry V of England seized the opportunity to press his claim to the French throne, trouncing the French at the Battle of Agincourt and conquering Normandy. France teetered on the brink of ruin. On October 21st, 1422, after 3 harrowing decades as the Mad King, Charles VI died a broken man in his bed at the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris, likely aged beyond his 53 years by his travails. The cause was recorded as a fever, but even in death, intrigue swirled around the monarch. Rumours spread that Charles had actually been poisoned or smothered on his sickbed, by partisans eager to clear the way for a new ruler to rescue France from the abyss. Whatever the truth of his demise, Charles VI left behind a shattered kingdom, half overrun by the English, its once proud armies in disarray. It would take a teenage peasant girl, Joan of Arc, to rally the French to victory. But that is a tale for another time. The sad, strange reign of Charles VI is a reminder of the thin line between power and madness for the royalty of the Middle Ages. In an age before psychiatry, a severe mental illness could condemn even a king to a nightmarish existence, held captive by his own delusions while his kingdom burned. One shudders to imagine the torment of spending decades slipping in and out of insanity, your mind and kingdom crumbling around you in tandem. While other royals on our list were felled in their prime by the murderous plots of rivals, Charles VI's fate almost seems a more exquisite cruelty. To be driven to madness on the throne, at the mercy of your innermost demons, as well as the very real ones swirling outside your palace gates. It is a chilling lesson in how even the grandest medieval monarchs could fall victim to misfortunes of the mind. With that unsettling thought, let us leave Charles the Mad to his rest and turn our attention now across the Alps to the warmer climes of Italy. There we find our next tragic royal, a queen as renowned for her brilliance as she was for the dark rumours that shadowed her. Joanna I of Naples. Born in 1326, Joanna was the eldest granddaughter of Robert the Wise, King of Naples. A thoroughly modern queen, Joanna would rule in her own right, a rarity in 14th century Europe. Cultured, intelligent, and strong-willed, she sought to make her kingdom a centre of art and learning, spending lavishly to beautify Naples and its churches. But Joanna's reign, much like her life, was marked by scandal and intrigue from the start. Married at just 15 to her cousin, the boorish Prince Andrew of Hungary, the young queen allegedly despised her husband. In 1345, after just 2 years of unhappy marriage, Andrew was brutally murdered, his body found strangled and defenestrated from a window at the Palace of Aversa. Whispers spread that the murder had been carried out on Joanna's orders to free herself from an adulterous and unbearable union. Joanna's enemies in Hungary demanded justice, accusing the queen of regicide. Under mounting pressure, Joanna fled to Avignon, where she used her considerable charms to win over Pope Clement VI. In a remarkable about-face, Clement cleared Joanna of all wrongdoing in Andrew's murder and permitted her to wed her cousin and alleged lover, Prince Louis of Taranto. It was a masterful political maneuver by a queen determined to hold onto her crown at all costs. But Joanna's Machiavellian machinations would come back to haunt her. Andrew's death had left a festering grudge with Louis the Great, King of Hungary and brother of the murdered prince. In 1347, a Hungarian army invaded Naples, forcing Joanna and Louis to flee. The Hungarians occupied the kingdom for several years before the royal couple could return. Joanna's reign continued to be marked by tumult, the Black Death, warring factions, and 4 successive husbands, including one who bigamously married the queen while his previous wife still lived. But through it all, Joanna tenaciously clung to her throne, cementing her reputation as one of the most formidable women in Europe. Alas, not even the wiliest queen could outrun her past misdeeds forever. In 1382, nearly 4 decades after Andrew's murder, Joanna's chickens finally came home to roost. The aging queen had named Louis of Anjou, a French prince, as her heir, rather than Charles of Durazzo, the last male descendant of the Neapolitan Capetians. Enraged, Charles invaded Naples with the backing of Pope Urban VI and Joanna's old nemesis, Louis of Hungary, who still nursed a vendetta over his brother's death. Joanna's defences crumbled, and she was captured by Charles's forces. The Durazzo prince, perhaps in vengeance for his great-uncle Andrew, had no mercy for Joanna despite her advanced age of 54 years. On May 12, 1382, Joanna was allegedly poisoned before being pushed out a window and strangled with a silken cord in the very castle where her first husband had died. It was a brutally poetic end for a queen who had once escaped the noose of justice for that very same crime. The once glittering Queen Joanna, who fancied herself a sophisticated patron of the arts, met a sordid end, sprawled in the dust beneath a castle window like a common criminal. With no heirs of her body, Joanna's death marked the end of Capetian rule in Naples after nearly 2 centuries. Louis of Hungary swiftly invaded to seize control of the kingdom, while the French princes fought for decades over Joanna's claim to Provence. It was a bloody postscript to the life of one of medieval Europe's most notorious queens. As we ponder Joanna's grim fate, it is hard not to draw comparisons to another famously murderous queen who lived 200 years later, England's Mary Stuart. Both were suspected of plotting their husbands' assassinations, both saw their reigns marred by intrigue and invasion, and both met brutal ends at the hands of their rivals. Perhaps it is the destiny of queens who dare to seize power in a man's world to find that power invariably slipping through their fingers and around their throats. Of course, not all the royals on our list were necessarily villains or victims. Some were simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, their lives cut short by the whims of capricious fortune. Such was the case of Gunther von Schwarzburg, a little-known 14th century German prince who made the fatal mistake of reaching for the imperial crown. In 1349, the Holy Roman Empire was in turmoil. The previous emperor, Louis IV, had died suddenly the year before, leaving no clear successor. The German prince-electors, perennially wary of hereditary monarchy, passed over Louis's young son and instead chose Charles of Bohemia as the next emperor. But Charles was not without his challengers. Gunther von Schwarzburg, a minor count from Thuringia, had his own designs on the imperial throne. With the backing of some discontented German nobles, Gunther was elected anti-king by a rival faction to challenge Charles's claim. It was a bold play for a man with a weak power base, and it would not end well for the would-be usurper. After just 4 months of styling himself King of the Romans, Gunther's quest for the crown came to an abrupt and brutal end. In June 1349, Charles of Bohemia's forces clashed with Gunther's supporters near the city of Eltville. Gunther's men were routed, and the pretender himself was captured after his horse stumbled and fell in the melee. Any hope for mercy from the victorious Charles would prove illusory. The Bohemian king was determined to make an example of his upstart rival. Gunther was subjected to the grisliest execution reserved for traitors in the Middle Ages, the breaking wheel. In a grotesque public spectacle, Gunther's limbs were smashed with a heavy wagon wheel, pulverizing his bones. His mangled body was then quartered and finally decapitated, as blood-spattered onlookers jeered and recoiled. But Charles was not content to let Gunther's humiliation end with his horrible death. He ordered the dead man's body parts to be displayed in towns across Germany as a gruesome warning to any who would dare challenge his authority. Gunther's severed head was impaled on a spike above the gates of Frankfurt, while his quarters were hung from the walls of other cities that had supported his claim. It was a shockingly ruthless display, even by the harsh standards of medieval justice. Poor Gunther had gambled for glory, staking his life on a long-shot bid for the imperial crown, and lost in the most nightmarish fashion imaginable. The moral of Gunther's story? Perhaps it is this. In the game of medieval thrones, the price of failure was dizzyingly high. A botched power grab would not merely cost you your life, but very possibly your dignity and humanity as well. When one reached for the ultimate prize of the imperial crown, one had best be certain of success, or resign oneself to the possibility of being reduced to a literally shattered mockery in death. With that macabre memento mori, we turn now to our final haunting figure, a devious and ruthless royal, perhaps more unsettling than any other on our list, for she was no monarch, but a simple mother-in-law with a bone to pick. Ermengarde of Anjou was never meant to wield great power. Born around 956 AD into a noble French family, she was married off while still a teenager to Conan I of Rennes, Count of Brittany. But Ermengarde's path to infamy began in earnest with the death of her husband in 992. Now a widow with a young son, Geoffrey, to protect, Ermengarde proved herself a force to be reckoned with. She maneuvered to have Geoffrey betrothed to Hedwig, the sister of Richard II, Duke of Normandy, an alliance that greatly strengthened her son's position. A few years later, after Richard II's death, Ermengarde even briefly served as regent of Brittany, while Duke Geoffrey fought to secure his claim. It was a heady taste of authority for a medieval noblewoman, and one that Ermengarde was loath to relinquish. In 1008, Duke Geoffrey married Havois of Normandy, the daughter of Richard II, but it was his mother Ermengarde who continued to wield the real power behind the scenes at the Breton court. Ermengarde's implacable will and domineering ways soon brought her into conflict with her daughter-in-law. Havois was beautiful, vivacious, and bold, a far cry from the meek broodmare Ermengarde wanted for her son. The Duchess refused to be cowed by Ermengarde's imperious manner, and tensions between the two women soon boiled over into outright hostility. Ermengarde, incensed at this threat to her influence, decided to take drastic action. She began whispering poisonous rumors in her son's ear, slandering Havoise as an adulteress and a schemer. Determined to be rid of the troublesome Duchess, Ermengarde browbeat Duke Geoffrey into imprisoning his own wife, locking her away in a tower. It was a step too far, even for the formidable Ermengarde. Havoise managed to smuggle out a plea for help to her kinsman, the powerful Count of Blois. Enraged at his cousin's mistreatment, the Count raised an army and marched on Brittany, demanding Havoise's release. Ermengarde and Geoffrey had no choice but to submit, and the furious Duchess was freed. But Havoise's trials were far from over, and Ermengarde's malice would soon rebound upon her tenfold. Havoise fled to the court of her brother, Richard III of Normandy, and begged him to intervene. Richard, along with the Count of Blois and the vengeful Havoise, launched an invasion of Brittany to topple Ermengarde and Geoffrey. After a brief but bloody struggle, Rennes fell to the Norman and Blois forces. Duke Geoffrey was captured and imprisoned, while Ermengarde fled in defeat. But her flight was short-lived. The victorious Havoise hunted down her hated mother-in-law and subjected her to a punishment as cruel as it was chillingly apposite. On the orders of Havoise and her allies, Ermengarde was dragged in chains to a dank, lightless dungeon beneath the castle of Rennes. There, the once proud noblewoman who had schemed for so long to hold on to power was thrown into the oubliette, and the door sealed shut behind her. Ermengarde had dared to strike at Havoise, and now she would suffer the same fate she had inflicted on her daughter-in-law, to waste away forgotten in a dark hole, buried alive. But Havoise's revenge was even more exquisite, for she denied Ermengarde even the smallest morsel of food or drop of water in her black prison. Slowly, agonizingly, over days stretching into weeks, Ermengarde starved to death in the suffocating dungeon, her once formidable mind and body gradually consumed by the gnawing torments of hunger and thirst. It is said her piteous moans echoed through the stones of Rennes Castle for a month before at last falling silent. When Ermengarde's emaciated corpse was finally dragged up from the oubliette, its withered arms still reaching for a sustenance that never came, even hardened warriors shuddered at the sight. Havoise, it is said, merely smiled in grim satisfaction to see her nemesis laid low. The story of Ermengarde's hideous fate spread through France, a brutally clear message to other nobles tempted to overreach. A mother-in-law's meddling, even that of a high-born lady, could have consequences more nightmarish than any nagging or disapproving glares. The sheer inhumanity of Ermengarde's end, wasting away in abject misery, cast a pall over even the pitiless landscape of medieval European power struggles. In Ermengarde's ugly demise, we see a dark mirror held up to the cruelty of the Middle Ages, a world in which even family bonds offered no assurance of safety or regard. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all is that sometimes the most implacable foes could emerge not from the ranks of rival kings or rebel lords, but from inside one's own castle walls, the enemy you invited in through holy matrimony. The bitter end of the once glittering Ermengarde of Anjou is a grim reminder that the grand halls and golden trappings of medieval royalty concealed a nest of vipers, coiled and waiting to strike at the slightest hint of weakness or wounded pride. Blood, be it that of kin or rival, was all too often the coin of the realm. And so we come to the end of our journey through the grim Anne. As we've seen, the veneer of royal power and privilege in medieval Europe was often a thin one, easily shattered by the ever-present threats of violence, treachery, and intrigue that seemed to stalk the halls of even the grandest palaces. The grisly fates of monarchs like Edward II, Charles VI, Joanna I, and the luckless Gunther von Schwarzburg serve as chilling reminders of just how precarious the position of a ruler could be in an age when rivals and enemies were rarely far from the throne room. But even those royal figures who never wore a crown were not immune to the deadly schemes and power plays that so often ended in murder most foul. Take, for example, the tragic tale of Blanche of Bourbon, the young wife of King Pedro of Castile. Married off to the Castilian ruler at the tender age of 13 to secure a political alliance, Blanche soon found herself caught in a web of court intrigue and romantic jealousy that would ultimately seal her doom. Despite her youth and beauty, Blanche was never able to win the affections of her husband, who openly preferred the company of his mistress, Maria de Padilla. As tensions mounted between the king and his scorned wife, Pedro's enemies saw an opportunity to use Blanche as a pawn in their own schemes to seize power. In 1361, just 6 years after her marriage, Blanche was imprisoned on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason, her fate left in the hands of a cruel and vengeful husband. For 8 long years, the unfortunate queen languished in captivity, her health and spirit slowly broken by the hardships of her confinement. At last, in 1369, Pedro ordered Blanche's execution, determined to be rid of his troublesome wife once and for all. The method of her death remains a mystery to this day. Some say she was poisoned, others that she was smothered or strangled in her sleep. But whatever the means, the outcome was the same. Another promising young life, cut short by the ruthless dynastic politics of the age. Blanche's sad end is a reminder that, for women in particular, the glittering world of medieval royalty could be a gilded cage, one in which even queens were little more than pawns to be used and discarded at the whims of kings and courtiers. From the lonely death of Ermengarde of Anjou, starved in a dungeon by her own vengeful son, to the brutal demise of Joanna I, hurled from a castle window by her ambitious cousins, the fates of these royal women underscore the cruel reality that, in the Game of Thrones, there could be no winners, only survivors. As we come to the end of our journey through the shocking annals of medieval royal deaths, it's worth reflecting on what these grim tales can tell us about the nature of power and the human capacity for violence and cruelty. Though the kings and queens of old may have wielded vast armies and untold riches, they were, in the end, as vulnerable to the vagaries of fate as any common peasant. In a world where the line between palace and prison was often blurred, where the hand that held the scepter one day might be cold and lifeless the next, perhaps the greatest power of all was the power to endure, to cling to life and hope in the face of even the darkest of circumstances. It is this resilience, this unquenchable human spirit, that shines through even the most disturbing chapters of our history, a testament to the enduring strength and courage of our ancestors. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the ill-fated royals of ages past, whose lives and deaths, however distant in time, still have much to teach us about the timeless struggles of power, ambition, and the fleeting nature of earthly glory. May their stories be a reminder to cherish the peace and stability of our own lives, and to never take for granted the blessings of a world where the horrors of the medieval past are just that, a distant memory, fading into the mists of history. If you've enjoyed this journey through the dark corners of royal history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating tales of the forgotten past. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may your own story be one of a long life, good health, and a peaceful rest.